Mr. Chair, you may begin.
Thank you. Good evening. Welcome to this Planning Commission study session of Monday, March 1st, 2021. Call the study session to order. And we will make sure we have all our participants. Very good. I can see we've got everybody. So please join me in the Pledge of Allegiance. Commissioners, please mute your microphones. I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all. Great, thanks. And Ms. Green, roll call, please.
Councilmember Zick.
I'm here.
Commissioner Zick.
I'm here.
Wow.
Thank you.
Is there something you didn't tell us, John?
No.
Okay.
Commissioner Tourget.
I think Commissioner Tourget is going to be absent this evening.
All right. Commissioner Toller.
Here.
Commissioner Stevens.
Here.
Commissioner Russell.
Here.
Vice Chair Colbert.
Present.
Chair D'Erico.
Here.
Thank you.
Thank you very much, Julie. Julie, Brenda. See, I'm on top of it. In order to minimize the spread of the COVID-19 virus, Governor Newsom has issued executive orders that temporarily suspend requirements of the Brown Act, which allows Planning Commission members to attend Planning Commission meetings telephonically. Given the health risks associated with the COVID-19, the City Council chambers are closed to the public until further notice. If you'd like to participate in tonight's study session, you can participate via the following options. You are encouraged to observe the Planning Commission study session live on Costa Mesa TV, Spectrum Channel 3 and ATT Universe Channel 99, and online at youtube.com/Costa Mesa TV. You can also participate via Zoom by following the instructions on tonight's agenda, which you can find online at the city's website. During the public comment portion of the study session, if you are participating via Zoom webinar, use the raise hand function located in the participants window and wait for city staff to acknowledge your name and unmute your line when it is your turn to speak. Comments are limited to 2 minutes tonight for the study session or as otherwise directed. You can also participate in tonight's study session via telephone by dialing 1-669-900-6833. Webinar ID is 960-6037-9921. And the passcode is 595958. During the public comment period, if you're participating via telephone, press *9 to add yourself to the queue and wait for city staff to announce your name, phone number, and then press *6 to unmute your line when it is your turn to speak. Comments are limited to 2 minutes or as otherwise directed. So with that, Ms. Green, could you announce the item tonight, the study session?
Thank you. This is special study session item 2021-2029 housing element status update.
Thank you, Ms. Green. Ms. Ashabi, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Chair. I'm going to give a little brief introduction.
Ms. Lee, I'm sorry very much. Absolutely. Go ahead.
That's okay. Thank you, everyone, for being here tonight. This is a special study session of the Planning Commission in order for staff to provide a status update regarding the city's housing element update. As you know, the housing element is a chapter of the city's general plan and a very important component to the city's long-term conversation about land use policy as well as housing policy here in the city. So tonight's presentation will be a little bit of a combination. First, we'll start out with Minu Ashabi, our principal planner, and then we will have the remainder of the presentation by Mr. Nick Chen with Kimley Horn, who is our housing element consultant. So with that, I'd like to turn it over to Mrs. Shabi. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Good evening, Mr. Chair, Planning Commissioners. In tonight's presentation, we have a brief recap of what has been discussed in previous meetings as to why the housing element needs to be updated, what steps the city has taken so far, a summary of the community outreach plan, and what data we have collected to date, including the community survey. We will also cover the other components of the housing element, such as the community profile and the site inventory analysis. As you may have previously heard, the housing element is one of the required general plan elements. It is required to be updated every 8 years, and it's the only element that needs to be certified by the state. Adopting a housing element requires a general plan amendment. It is subject to at least one public hearing by the Planning Commission and one by the City Council. The housing element is required to be adopted by October 15 of this year. As you may know, the city is located in the SCAG region. SCAG is Southern California Council of Governments. SCAG receives the regional housing allocation, what is referred to as RHNA. Regional Housing Needs Assessment for the region from the State Department of Housing and Community Development. SCAG distributes RHNA to jurisdictions in the region based on a methodology that takes into account certain factors such as existing needs, vacancy rates, proximity to transit, and the preliminary allocations were approved in September of last year. RHNA allows for an appeal process, which in this cycle, the deadline was October 26 of 2020. SCAG received a total of 52 appeals. 19 of them were from the County of Orange. We presented our appeal in January 22nd, and we made a compelling argument that there were constrained areas in the city, such as the parks and state-owned land, John Wayne Airport, and all those external factors that could not lead to housing development within the next 8 years. Even though there was a general discussion among the subcommittee members that the allocation of 1.34 million was unrealistic, all appeals except for 2 that were not in Orange County were denied. So the final number for RHNA was slightly increased from 11,733 to 11,760, and that minor increase is due to the fact that 2 appeals were approved and that number was redistributed to the region. I will hand it over to Nick Chen with Kimley Horn, and he will go over the remaining steps that we are following to proceed to the final housing element adoption.
Thank you, Minu. Mr. Kent, go ahead.
Thank you. Good evening, Chair, members of the Commission. My name is Nick Chen. I believe I saw many of you at our district-specific meetings recently, so it's good to see so many faces again. As Minu mentioned, I will be going through the remainder of our presentation tonight, and then happy to answer questions afterwards. So next step on the presentation is a little bit about what happens if the city has a non-compliant housing element. And essentially that's if the city does not adopt a housing element or adopts a housing element that the state has not deemed compliant. And a couple of the potential options, these are just options that have happened to other jurisdictions and per state law could happen to Costa Mesa if there was a non-compliant housing element, is a loss of eligibility for certain future state grants, potential loss of some level of local control over development. Court may suspend the city's authority to issue building permits until the housing element can get essentially adopted or certified. HCD may forward a non-compliance case to the California Office of the Attorney General, or outside groups may sue the city on the grounds of not having compliant housing element. So all things that we would like to avoid. Additional legislation, there's a lot of housing legislation out there, but a few to be aware of. One is SB 35. This is a streamlined development process. So in the event the city goes through the process, does develop a compliant housing element, and then begins building over the next 8 years, HCD will actually be monitoring that development through the city's annual progress reports every year. And essentially it will look to see if the city is doing a proportionate amount of their arena or keeping pace in a sense. And if not, the state will look at potentially SB 35 as a way to streamline development process. Another is AB 72, which grants HCD some more review authority than they currently had or previously had, to be able to look and see and basically look and make sure that the city of Costa Mesa has a compliant housing element and that they are meeting the requirements of the housing plan and the programs and policies in that housing plan. So each program and policy is going to have a timeline, and HCD will be conducting reviews again annually to make sure that those timelines are being hit. If it's found that the city does not have is not hitting a goal at any point, the state likely will give the city some time to remedy that and have some discussions. But if it's not remedied, they may revoke compliance. So a little bit about our community outreach process. I mentioned the district-specific meetings, but we've actually been doing a lot of community outreach even beyond those. So in November of last year, we held the first virtual town hall meeting. There will be another one later on in the process. After that, we followed up with a community survey that was available for roughly 3 months from November to February 22nd and closed right after our district-specific meetings, which were held a little bit earlier that week. We've also held in that time subject matter expert meetings with home builders and developers, as well as housing advocacy groups. We got a lot of great feedback that we'll be going through just a highlight of in just a little bit. All materials were provided in English and Spanish. In many cases, all the presentations, I believe, there were English and Spanish presentations conducted fully in Spanish with some translation services, as well as all the materials and the survey was in English and Spanish as well. In addition to that, there's been a large social media outreach, community platforms, and online engagement to get as much feedback as we can on the housing element update process. And you'll see through some of the numbers coming up in terms of participants that it's worked pretty well. So the town hall meeting back in November, just to refresh your mind, we had around 78 attendees. There were 2 presentations, one in English and one in Spanish. And it really was sort of the kickoff for the community of this process. It was the introduction to what the housing element is, what the city is required to do, and essentially what the process would be in a rough outline of the timeline. That presentation is still available on the city's housing element update website and has been viewed since. So it's great that one of the downsides not being able to do it in person is that we can't be in person, but one of the upsides is that we can record everything and put it on the website. So everything you're seeing me present here is going to be put on the website if it's not already up there. So we talked about featuring opportunities for community engagement, many of them being what we'll discuss tonight, followed by public comments and questions. The survey actually got a total between the English and Spanish versions of 465 individual responses, which is an amazing turnout. And so it was available for approximately 3 months, as I mentioned, and it asked questions about types of housing growth, potential housing areas at a high level, and then asked a question about the community vision and how people saw the community growing. That data, since the survey did just close about a week ago, is still being kind of researched through, especially because the vision question and some of the others were free response. So they do take some time to go through 460 plus responses, but staff and the consultant team are currently working through those responses. A little bit of the high level feedback we can give are a couple of the questions that were asked. So because of the number of units that Costa Mesa has to plan for, multifamily housing is going to be a part of that strategy. So we asked the question about what types of multifamily housing should the city of Costa Mesa plan for its residents. We saw a response of mixed use at 28%, apartments at 32%, multi-generational housing, which is interesting, at 28%, and then co-living units or sort of a dormitory style living at 12%. We also looked at preferred areas to prioritize housing development. So where in the community should housing development go? And this was not site specific or parcel specific. This was more conceptual. As you can see, 26% said along major streets. Another 22% said existing neighborhoods. 20% said prioritize accessory dwelling units. 19% said city-owned properties, and then 13% said older shopping centers. So we followed that meeting with the meeting that you all, many of you participated in, the district-specific meetings on the 17th and 18th of February. We had around 46 participants on the first night, which was districts 1, 2, and 3, and a Spanish breakout session, and then 55 on the following night for districts 4, 5, and 6. The meetings mainly focused on, again, what potential development areas, although this was much more specific than the survey got, if you recall, and as I'll show on the next page, we actually had maps on there, and we were taking sort of parcel or area specific notes on each of those maps. Again, those are being compiled right now. We looked at the unique characteristics and history of each district. I think the purpose of these meetings was to focus on not Costa Mesa as a whole, but realizing that the districts within Costa Mesa are unique, and we wanted to find out exactly what made them unique and how that should affect planning for the future of housing in each district and in Costa Mesa as a whole. And so we also looked at the opportunities and challenges within each district. Each district has a different makeup, and so there are different opportunities and challenges presented by the components of those, be it physically or for the folks who live there. All of these meeting notes and recordings will be available and on the Housing Element Update website. I believe those are being uploaded now if they are not up there yet. So in district meetings, we went over, as I mentioned, housing opportunities and challenges. We looked at community services, housing types, and a couple of topics that differed between districts. These were largely group conversations. So what happened essentially was we started off with the same questions, and then every group went in a slightly different direction, which is part of what makes the district meetings great, is because there are unique concerns within each district. And so we got a lot of great feedback, as you can see the map here showing, I believe, District 2, and some of the feedback that we got for areas within there. We did talk about community vision and newer innovative trends and ideas for potential housing. And all of these maps will also be available on the website as well. So the subject matter expert meetings, I won't go through all of these, but essentially, as I mentioned earlier, we had one subject matter expert meeting for home builders and developers, and another one for housing advocacy groups. We also have a third actually tomorrow for community groups that was rescheduled so we could get higher attendance. Oh, sorry, skipped ahead. So a little bit of a summary of the housing builders developer meeting. Essentially was all focused on the process, development process, and what could help to facilitate the development of housing. There were a number looking at fees, looking at the current zoning code and the application process, and ways to streamline that and provide more certainty. Whereas the housing advocacy groups looked at plans for workforce housing, looked at how to include housing for all sectors of the community, how to partner with churches or city-owned properties, and solutions to be able to distribute housing more equitably and fairly throughout the community. What both groups agreed on was that we need to build housing in Costa Mesa and that it's needed in Costa Mesa. So that was good to see. A lot of creative solutions came out of those. So before we get too far into planning for the future of housing in Costa Mesa, we have to look at the existing condition and what's on the ground now. So one of the sections, probably the first major section in the housing element, is what we call the community profile. And it's essentially a demographic, economic, and housing characteristics section that will go over a number of different topics relating to overall community makeup in terms of population, be that types of households, ethnicity or racial demographics. Goes over the housing statistics for large households and other categories, talks about special needs groups, and it contains a lot of data, most of which is benchmarked off the US Census and their projections based off, again, off the most recent census. So the community profile also informs programs and policies within the housing element that are tied to state-specific characteristics. So there are a couple housing profile policies and programs that are state mandated, but most of them are based on community needs. So essentially, what comes out of this information helps to feed into justifying where the city should prioritize their efforts over the next 8 years. So I want to go through just a couple slides talking about some of the data that's in this. When the public review draft does come out, and actually prior to that, you'll be able to see all of this information laid out, and it provides a very, very comprehensive overview of the community. So what we're talking about tonight is just high level. But as you can see, a couple statistics for the community, 42.8% married coupled households. What's interesting is 40.2% non-family households, which essentially is renters, anybody living on their own or a non-traditional family type as defined by the census. So you can see it fairly even. Costa Mesa is right there in the middle in terms of average household size at 2.7, same as Irvine, less than Santa Ana, but just slightly less than the county as a whole. In terms of households by income category, so this is existing households by income category, and this is households that qualify for each income category. Essentially, the way it breaks down is the majority, 52.8%, are moderate or above moderate, meaning that they make over 80% of the area median family income for the county. You can see it then breaks down from there to 18% for low, 12.9% for very low, and then 16% for extremely low.
Nick, if I could ask just a real quick question.
Yeah, of course.
Is it generally recognized that moderate and above moderate is market rate housing?
Those, yes, they do tend to correlate with market rate housing.
Thank you. Go ahead.
Yep. And so last you can see 30% below or less, 16.3%. So these statistics kind of fall in line with those as you go through. Costa Mesa is just slightly below the median household income for the county. So Costa Mesa is at 79,207, and the county as a whole, Orange County as a whole, is at 85,398. You can see Newport Beach is at 122,000, while Irvine's at 100,000, and Santa Ana at 61. So Costa Mesa falls somewhere in the middle of that range. Another interesting statistic is that roughly, you can see here, 60% of the households within Costa Mesa make less than just under $100,000 a year. And Manu was going through earlier, she pointed out the RENA allocation slide, which is those income categories are based on the median income for the county, which is just for a family of 4, which is just over 103. So you can see 60% of households in Costa Mesa are just under that. I talked a little bit earlier about, I mentioned special needs groups in Costa Mesa, and there's a number of housing element defined special needs groups, and they tend to go beyond what we commonly refer to as special needs groups. And you can see they're divided up. Some of them are by person and some are by household. Again, I won't go through all of them, but a couple of interesting ones that stick out. 10.7% of the population are senior or 65 and older. Persons with disabilities is 8.1%. Large households, which is one of the sections that we do look at planning and does affect housing development in the future, is just under 10%. So those are households that may be a little unique in that most apartments typically go to about 3 bedrooms max. So you're looking at either some kind of interesting townhouse situation or a single family to be able to truly accommodate those households. And then as we go through single parent households at 9.2%, and then 12.9% of people living in poverty is defined by the housing element or by the census. Next is overcrowding of units. Overcrowding of units actually is defined as more than one person per room, more than one person per bedroom, I should say. So Costa Mesa is right about 9%, less than Santa Ana, as you can see, but higher than, just higher than the county average, or basically right at the county average, and higher than some of the surrounding cities. So those are, it's a factor that takes into account potential overcrowding within the community. And then lastly, I have just a slide talking about the community, total household units by type, which is, again, is a very interesting, at least for me, as someone who lives there, I wouldn't necessarily guess that the community was comprised of this many multifamily units, but you can see 50.3% are multifamily units, where 37.7% are single family detached, and 9.6% are single family attached. So when you combine the single family, there's just slightly more multifamily, with the remaining mobile homes about 2.4%. Similarly, as you go through, total occupied units for renter versus a homeowner, homeowner is just over 40%, where renter occupied is almost 60%. So the community is more renter occupied, which does tend to kind of fall in line with the larger amount of multifamily that's found. So we're going to go a little bit into just a high level, the sites inventory analysis and how we walk through this process. We did go through some of this in the district specific meetings, but this is a good refresh as we go into tonight's conversation. So the project team focuses on looking at existing and potential future capacity, basically the entire community. We need to review every parcel in the community, whether it's zoned for residential uses or not. We look at vacant sites, underutilized parcels, existing commercial properties with mixed use potential, and even light industrial business park areas, because we do look at potentially rezone strategies if those are needed. The city must also consider the existing use. So basically what is there now, what type of business is there, and what's the likelihood that it can be redeveloped for residential uses within the planning period. HCD does look for the city to look at things like leases if those are potentially available, but oftentimes they're not public documents. So city compiles as much data as it can. Potential site strategy or potential strategy. So a couple strategies to accommodate the city's need all center around one kind of key topic, and that's the default density that the city has. We've discussed this at previous meetings, but for anybody who missed the previous meetings or needs a refresher, the default density is essentially the density at which HCD deems housing can be developed for lower income within the community. And it's based on where the community size, the makeup of the community in terms of where it's located and in what areas it's located within the region. So where Costa Mesa sits, that number is 30 DU an acre, as with pretty much every other Orange County city, unless it's a very, very small city, in which case it might be lower. So that's essentially what all of these strategies center around. One is to create a new residential zone that permits development at 30 units an acre. Next is to expand mixed use overlay to permit 30 DU an acre. And the last is to look at the residential incentive overlay district and expand that where applicable. One other thing to take into consideration as we look at the sites analysis is affirmatively furthering fair housing. This is a fairly new law that looks into essentially a fair and equitable distribution of housing throughout the community. It is something that's being looked at very heavily this round of sites now, or this round of housing element updates, and looks at making sure that there's no one area within the community that's overburdened with future planning for any one income category as the housing element process goes through. It does not take a look at the housing element and say, we need to split the city up into an even grid and put 5 units in each of those grids. It's not how it works. It's much more detailed than that. It takes into consideration the existing households where existing single family and multifamily are, where existing low income housing already is, and also where resources, transportation, and employment are located. And also considers access to public transit and community resources that are needed daily. So with that, I'm just going to go through a few next steps. And before I even talk about the next steps, I highlight there is still a lot that will be brought before the Planning Commission, the City Council, the community. This process is, I'd say we're still going through and still in the early phases, or also we'll say getting close to the middle phases now. But essentially, here's a couple of the things that we have to go through throughout the rest of this process. So continued community outreach efforts. As I mentioned, we have one more subject matter expert meeting. We also are going to finalize review of the district meeting and community survey data. We received a lot of information, and we're really thankful for everybody who took time to participate, both in the survey and in the district meetings. We will have additional City Council and Planning Commission study sessions before the draft document is released to give both you and City Council members the opportunity to comment. We will finalize the constraints, resources, sites analysis, and housing plan, which are the remaining sections to go through on top of the community profile. Also, a review of past performance, which is a look back at the 5th cycle, and a couple other appendices like a glossary of terms. We will then, once everybody's had a chance to review, release a public review draft document so the community has the opportunity to give the input on the review document. Typically, this is when we will hold our second town hall so that we can walk through the document and talk about some of the highlights. It's a very long document, so we won't be able to go through the whole thing, but we can definitely provide highlights on that and give some people context into how the document was developed and how to read it. Then also provide, I believe it's generally about a month, though the timeline does vary, for review and feedback that we can incorporate into an HCD review draft, which is a document that ultimately goes to HCD to be reviewed for compliance with state housing law. Lastly, by October 15th, 2021, that is the date in which the City of Costa Mesa must locally adopt the housing element. And so that is our end date and the goal and the end of this process. So with that, I am happy to stop sharing my screen and hand it back to you, Chair. And feel free to ask any questions of myself or staff. We're all available.
Thank you, Mr. Chen. Having witnessed Kimley Horn's housing element presentations in other jurisdictions, monitoring those, you did a great job as always in making the presentation. I think, commissioners, what I'd like to do is go ahead and open public comment for the presentation tonight and receive public comment, and that may precipitate more questions from the commission. So Ms. Green, if we have members of the public who wish to comment for 2 minutes tonight, I'll let you take over. So I'll open public comment.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. The first speaker will be Kathy Esfahani.
Thank you. This is Kathy. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Great. I'd like to echo the praise for Kimley Horn and also staff in conducting a very robust public outreach, and also the report that was put together. I had a chance to read it this afternoon, and I thought it very well captured the comments and the suggestions that came from housing advocates. I'm a member of the Costa Mesa Affordable Housing Committee, and no matter how robust the community outreach is, that the proof will be in the pudding in terms of what gets in the housing element itself. And so our coalition would like to suggest several policies which we believe will be effective in actually getting affordable housing built in Costa Mesa to address the overwhelming need. The first is a very effective inclusionary ordinance that will require at least 15% of all new residential development to be affordable to lower income households. It would be great if it was like a 5-5-5 split, 5% extremely low, 5% very low, and 5% low. We also recommend that the city consider amending existing urban plans, specific plans, and residential overlays to include an affordable housing requirement. Those existing plans and overlays were adopted in a previous time when the council was not concerned about affordable housing and there was not that sense of crisis that exists today. So I urge you to look at those plans and include a new requirement that 20% of units be affordable for lower income households. The property owners that get this upzone get a tremendous increase in property value, and the city must recover some of that benefit for the community through affordable housing. We also recommend that with Fairview Developmental Center, that the planning be changed, or the zoning be changed to allow much more housing there. The existing general plan caps housing at, I think, about 500 or so residential units. This is 100 acres. And it is, we know it's owned by the state, but we believe Costa Mesa can take steps now to facilitate the development of more housing there. So rezone it and then lobby the state to donate the land to a land trust in Costa Mesa for use as affordable housing. And we recommend that the city see it as a possible site of a residential village, which includes affordable housing for families, larger units for larger families, a place for permanent supportive housing, housing for disabled people, mixed use housing. There's so much opportunity there to come up with something that's very smart and beneficial for the city.
Thank you, Ms. Esfahani. Your time is up.
Oh, okay, thank you.
Thank you. If you would like to speak to the Planning Commission, okay, the next one is Mr. Rutherford.
This is Cassius, a Costa Mesa resident.
Go ahead, sir.
This is Cassius. Can you hear me?
Yes.
I wanted to, as a Costa Mesa resident, reiterate and express strong support for the points that Kathy just raised. I believe she was also going to finish with mentioning that the Affordable Housing Coalition also recognizes that the city needs to look at Measure Y as a constraint to development. And lastly, I just want to say, I think there's this perception of, Costa Mesa, other cities in Orange County, suburban, single family. But I think the data that Nick just presented is a really powerful case for how our city is different now. And, we're really a renter majority city here. So I urge you to keep that at the front of your mind as you go through this process. Thank you.
Thank you.
All right, the next speaker will be Cynthia McDonald, please.
Hi, Cynthia McDonald. I just wanted to point out that the district meetings were held during ski week. So we might have had a better participation if it had been held at a different time. I'm glad the staff report mentions SB 35 because it could have a big impact on the city if it fails to zone for the housing required by our arena. What the staff report didn't tell you, but Mr. Chin touched on, is that if we aren't able to meet our affordable housing goals, a developer is able to use the streamlined process, and then the city gives up a lot. And by a lot, I mean that SB 35 projects are exempt from CEQA because CEQA only applies to discretionary actions. If there were impacts that could be disclosed under CEQA, the city would have no right to compel the applicant to mitigate those impacts. Now, those of you who were around during the 2016 general plan update, remember the 11th hour financial analysis that told the story about how high density housing in the wrong place would impact the city's bank account. The property taxes from new high density units then proposed under the general plan would not cover the cost to mitigate the impacts. So under SB 35, not only would you lose the ability to control height, setbacks, parking, impacts to traffic, you'd lose the ability to recover the cost of increased emergency service demands, excess use of parks, etc. So you need to think carefully about what properties you propose to rezone for housing. The city really needs to adopt an inclusionary housing ordinance so the city controls development, not developers, and so that we can provide workforce housing. For years, I've asked the city to develop a vision for the future of Costa Mesa. The time to start thinking about that task was a long time ago, but you can still take control. One of the city council persons brought up NIMBYism in the district meeting I attended. Well, there are two meanings for that acronym. One is, next, it might be you. This city is your backyard. Think about what you would want in your backyard and how you can define the vision of the future of Costa Mesa. Also, Measure Y exempts affordable housing mandated by the state. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you. Mr. Morse, please.
Well, it's very simple what I have to say. Out of 11,000 plus units that need to be built, how about a couple hundred of them for permanent supportive housing? This will help out our homeless problem along with the housing problem. Thank you, gentlemen and ladies.
Thank you, sir.
If anybody else would like to speak, please raise your hand now. All right, Linda.
Hi, this is Linda, and I'm also part of the Costa Mesa Affordable Housing Coalition. And I wanted to just echo Kathy's comments and Cash's comments, but I also wanted to touch upon what Mr. Chen spoke about earlier in regards to the potential strategies on creating new residential zones, the overlays specifically. I just wanted to note that default density at 30 units per acre doesn't necessarily produce affordable housing for lower income households. I think to have a more effective strategy to achieve the city's lower income arena, the city should consider having proposed residential or mixed use developments in the overlays to be allowed to upzone it at 30 units per acre only if a percentage of units, such as like 20%, would be affordable to extremely low, very low, and low. And also another strategy could be to allow 100% affordable housing developments in the overlay by right at 30 units per acre for extremely low, very low, and low. And I think examples that we've seen that has been done throughout the county is the County of Orange and Fountain Valley. I believe they have overlays that do have triggers like this, that they don't just give away density, that they do ask something back from developers to ensure affordability for low-income households. I just want to thank you so much for allowing us to provide comments. And we really look forward to working with staff and the city to creating more affordable housing throughout the city. Thank you.
Thank you, Linda. Again, if anybody else wishes to speak, please raise your hand now. All right, we have T. O'Brien, please.
Hello, can you hear me?
Yes.
Thank you. This is Tim O'Brien. I'm with Legacy Partners. I'm a stakeholder. I was born and raised in Costa Mesa and developed and currently own the 580 Anton project in the town center. And you know, my only comment that I can add tonight would be to consider, in order to meet these RHNA goals and for that matter, to meet the goals of affordable housing and incent owners of properties that may be, you know, industrial properties or commercial properties, you know, to convert their properties to residential is to do that through density. And, you know, I'm seeing and hearing conversations about 30 units per acre, which would be very difficult to achieve any kind of realistic, you know, housing from at least from a rental perspective. And if you look at 580 by way of example, that's 125 units per acre. You probably wouldn't realize that driving by, but just that's by way of example. Now they don't need to be necessarily that dense, but many sites, whether they're in north of the freeway or, you know, along the major corridors or in the airport area, should be a higher density, because that's the way you'll attract, you know, market rate development with, you know, even including an affordable component or in lieu fee. So just a consideration. Thank you.
Thank you.
Okay, anybody else wishing to speak, please raise your hand. Mr. Chair, we see no other speakers.
Okay, I'll close public comment. If Commissioner Zick, I see your hand up. If you don't mind, I'm gonna kick off the discussion and then I'll go to you next with some questions. So I just kind of want to put a fence around this conversation a little bit. Mr. Chen, let me ask you. So we have, I'm going to start with our RHNA number of 11,760. And that we have a breakout that SCAG has assigned us to 2,919 very low, 1,794 low, and 2,080 moderate. I think so. I think that's roughly
2,088. Yep, you're close. Yep.
So we're about 6,800 units that we would consider in the real world where developers operate below market. So from my experience, and what I'm trying to get at is I have a feeling we're going to have to plan, or hopefully the market's going to have to produce a whole lot more than 11,000 units for this reason. The market rarely produces 100% affordable housing projects unless it's a joint venture between the city and some subsidy and a Jamboree Housing or somebody like that. So the reality is, if we're going to plan for, and hopefully the market will produce 6,800 below market rate affordable units. If you just apply the 15% rule under an inclusionary housing ordinance, we're actually going to have to plan for something like 45,000 units, because that's the only way you're going to get the 15% of to get to the 6,800. So I just want the public to be aware that this 11,000 number, unless every project that comes forward to match this is 100% affordable, we're going to be looking at far more than 11,000 units that will be coming forward in the market by in meeting this RENA obligation. Unless I'm wrong, that's the way I'm interpreting it.
I might just make one clarification if I
Sure.
could. So the city is required to, as you mentioned, plan for these units. It ultimately is up to the market to decide whether these units get built or not. As long as the city maintains capacity, so if they identify land, and one of the speakers correctly mentioned, 30 dwelling units an acre is the HCD default density. It's the planning purposes number. It doesn't mean that it will be affordable, but that's a number that HCD will accept in terms of an assumption. As long as as long as Costa Mesa keeps the capacity to accommodate those units, it doesn't necessarily mean that the city will need to build all of those units. You do get into some of what we discussed earlier about proportionality in terms of keeping pace and things like that. But overall, the housing element just needs to plan for those and essentially let the market dictate what's going to happen.
Understood. So now let me ask you a question relative to what the state might determine to be impediments to achieving those goals. What typically does the state not want to see a local jurisdiction do in terms of potential impediments to producing affordable housing?
Yeah, that is a broad question. So typically, the state will look at development standards. They will look at the required processes for building certain types of housing. They will look at things like community support of projects. They will look at a number of factors, anything of which essentially are what we'll call governmental constraints, because those are ones that the city can have some type of potential impact on. There's a number of non-governmental constraints as well, like land value, especially in areas like Costa Mesa or areas where land costs are higher, that play into the factor. But development process, potentially fees, zoning in terms of development standards or what the zoning permits. These are the kinds of things that the state will look at.
So the state, and I want to understand this. So the state could view an impediment as let's say an unreasonably low density or an unreasonably low FAR or an unreasonably restrictive height limit. Are those some of the things that the state might look at?
Yeah, in other jurisdictions, HCD has looked at height limits in certain zones to say, we don't think that you could reasonably develop the density that you're looking to develop in that zone if you have that height limit on there. They have made comments to that effect in the past. So yeah, those are the types of things.
Okay. So let's talk about how an inclusionary house, let's say for Grins, we left our density, highest density at 30 units to the acre, and we had an inclusionary housing ordinance of 15%. We don't even have to have an inclusionary housing ordinance. What percentage would a potential applicant have to go over that 30 dwelling units to the acre under a state density bonus law?
If I think I understand your comment, there's a kind of a sliding scale for state density bonus law for the different concessions you can get. So you can get up to 3 concessions, I believe. And I think density bonus has just changed actually. And I may not be caught up on the most recent changes. So Mindy or Jennifer, if you are caught up, just let me know. But typically it was at 20% low that you would start to get, or not start, but you would get, I believe, 3 concessions. Don't quote me on it because I think that may have changed really recently from something that I heard. But you would get 3 concessions. Essentially, you would get things like you could get parking reduction, you could get a raised FAR, or potentially, as negotiated, other development standard tweaks to other development standards as density bonus law permits.
Okay. So, Mr. Chen, you mentioned not complying with the housing element law or not having a certified housing element or having it revoked. You mentioned potential loss of local control. What would that look like? And would that potential loss of local control under the housing element law be independent of pieces of legislation that are floating around Sacramento, or SB 35, as you mentioned, which would that loss of local control be articulate what that would look like for us? Would it be a by right approval? What would it be?
Yeah, it could be right where you hit on. It could be by right approval if projects hit a certain percentage of affordability in them. So that it's not just straight out development. There are typically requirements like a certain percentage of affordable that go along to be able to get what we refer to as by right approval for certain projects. That has happened in jurisdictions in the past. I will say it's not the state's first, it's not what they go to first. There is generally always discussion with the city about what is, why the city is not in compliance, what they can do to be in compliance, and what needs to get accomplished, and then a certain time period to be able to accomplish that. And if all of that still fails, then we're looking at some of what we talked about earlier. But yeah, that is typically what we refer to when we talk about loss of local control, is the ability to review certain projects to the extent that they're reviewed now through the normal development process.
Okay. So let's talk about inventory analysis. When we submit our housing element, we have to have a roster of housing opportunity sites included in that housing element. And the state state evaluates those sites, correct?
Correct.
And I'm not certain. I mean, maybe you can give us a framework of what criteria the state applies to analyzing those sites, and two, what happens when they reject some?
So I'll go first. There is actually an HCD template that they've provided that is required of all housing elements. It's the first time we've had a standardized template. It's so the state can track all of the numbers essentially together as they do this annual reporting. And so that requires us to look at a number of factors, zoning, characteristics of the community. It has the city identify each parcel by assessor parcel number or APN, by address. It looks at all of those factors. The sites analysis itself has needs to evaluate site-specific conditions, looking at potentially overlay zones and the impacts that would have, looking at say physical limitations, known physical limitations. Obviously, this is a programmatic level document. This is not a site-specific development of any one parcel. So, the process evaluates known physical impediments and removing acreage for that. The state often, I will say, looks at the process rather than eliminating specific parcels. If they eliminate specific parcels, it's really because it's a large, we'll say it doesn't meet the requirements of AB 1397, the size requirements of, say it's either less than half an acre, in which case the state can still make an argument or a justification of those sites, or it's larger than 10 acres, which again, outside of maybe a couple parcels, isn't really a factor in Costa Mesa's, Costa Mesa's inventory. So those might be reasons the state would take out a parcel or question a parcel. It would be if they didn't meet the requirements of state law. It's generally not because, at least in my experience, the analysis doesn't show that it's a viable parcel. They may question certain ones to say, let's look at this use and see what it reasonably will redevelop. But to the extent that, again, with the number of sites that we have, the number of cities, 190 plus in the SCAG region, that are all being reviewed at the same time, the state just doesn't have the capacity to drill into every single site.
Okay. Thanks, Mr. Chen. Ms. Lee, I have a couple of questions, and also I may swerve into Mr. Preziosi's territory in a second, and then I'm almost done. So what's our process going to be when we go through this? We develop a draft housing ordinance, and we recognize that that it fundamentally is going to be a blueprint that will transform the way Costa Mesa looks. in the coming decades. When do we make the assessment of, gee, how is this updated housing element going to impact our land use element, our circulation element, our, well, those would be the two that I can think of would be the major ones. When do we assess what the impacts would be on those, and when would those be updated or amended to meet what the housing element is prescribing?
So you're essentially talking about internal consistency within our general plan between the housing element and circulation element and land use element. Those are probably the major ones. So the housing element process, although we do get into a sites analysis, as Nick said, it is at a programmatic level. We will have an environmental document that is associated with it from a CEQA compliance standpoint. And there will be a certain amount of analysis at the programmatic level that goes along with that. We have, after the housing element is adopted, per state guidance, we have 3 years from the time of that adoption to get into the details of what a general plan amendment or zone change might look like for any sites that we've identified in the housing element. So it's really part of that next phase of 3-year process that we would get into the details of internal consistency.
Okay, and that process afterwards might include, so let me back up a little bit. In terms of certifying the housing element, we've identified sites, and let's say many of the sites are currently commercially zoned, but in order to accommodate residential development on them, we might need to upzone them to mixed use or some other zone that includes residential. When would that process take place?
It would essentially be within that 3-year period.
Okay. Okay. And that would include also deciding what development standards we need to modify in order to accommodate this kind of blueprint for future housing in the city?
Absolutely. It's development standards, basic zoning, densities, and really any sort of required design guidelines that would go along with that. That's all wrapped up into the process of planning for implementation of the housing element.
Okay. Then I want to touch on 2 more things. Remedies the state has if we, 1, fail to file a certified housing element, or 2, we have one that ultimately gets revoked. What are the state's remedies in bringing us back into compliance?
So the state's remedies are typically, they would outline the process for why the city is not in compliance. So they would pick specific reasons the city is not in compliance, whether that's there's a shortfall in the site's inventory to meet the city's RENA need, whether there's a program like Jennifer mentioned, the 3-year compliance period for certain programs. If 3 years goes by and those actions have not been taken, that would be grounds for the city or for the state to consider us out of compliance. And then they would say essentially, okay, you have 3 or 6 months from now to get back in compliance. If not, these are some of the actions we talked about earlier, are some of the potential actions that the state would take. So there is sort of an understanding by the state that there needs to be a discussion and ultimately an agreement worked out, and that the city often can't just flip a switch and the next day take care of some of the issues for this. So there is a time period that's worked in as well.
But there's also a fining mechanism that the state has, correct?
Yes, the state could begin to fine the city of Costa Mesa for not being in compliance.
Okay.
Or any city.
Okay. And I'm familiar, and Nick, as I'm probably sure you know, I'm familiar with the maturations that the city of Encinitas went through on its housing element, and I know that there's some mid-cycle reporting requirements there. Why is that?
So essentially, the city of Encinitas has mid-cycle. They essentially have a 4-year update now. And a number of cities actually have this because they failed to locally adopt a housing element by the deadline. So as long as the city locally adopts, whether the city has a letter of substantial compliance from HCD or not, the document needs to be locally adopted by October 15th. It's the goal, and it is the absolute best option to have that letter. But if we're still in the, ironing out a few of the details of the HCD, and the city is confident that the housing element will be found in substantial compliance, it's the best course to go ahead and adopt locally, so that you don't have that mid-year or mid-cycle reporting period as well, or essentially update.
Okay. Okay, and my last topic, and thank you for indulging me, commissioners. Mr. Preziosi, is the elephant in the room, Measure Y. So I guess my question is this: obviously, we're going to the triggering mechanisms in Measure Y when it was written. What is being required of us from the state with respect to planning for this many units, how it's going to impact circulation, land use, density, trips, all of that is going to blow through the triggers for Measure Y, no problem. And yet we have this element in Y, in subsection E, where it says this article shall not apply to affordable housing proposals required by state or federal law. And I trust that. I don't know if you guys have kicked that around, what that actually means yet. I'm assuming that we're going to have to find a resolution to that question about what subsection E means at some point. But having witnessed also, and poor Mr. Chen will go back to Encinitas and say Costa Mesa is talking about them, but they have a similar measure called A that has been turned inside out by the courts for at least one housing cycle. I'm just wondering, at what point do we start wrestling with the question of how Y impacts our housing element in these general plan amendments?
Thank you, Chair D'Arcol. It's a nuanced question. Measure Y is not a model of clarity on these issues. We are reviewing it internally with staff. I don't have a specific timeline when it's coming out, but we are working on it. But I'm happy to answer any specific questions.
No, that's I'm sure we're going to have to answer that question eventually. And I know at least one court suspended Measure A in Encinitas for one housing cycle because that judge saw it as an impediment. So I just want to make sure that the public understands the size of the freight train barreling down the track at this city with this housing element and with the opposing interests of Measure Y. And what we need to try to accomplish just in planning it, and how we really can't throw up a ton of hurdles to stop it from happening. I'm watching all sorts of applications that are coming into jurisdictions under SB 330 where the city, if it meets land use designations and zoning and development standards, the city basically can't say no to them. And I just want to make sure the community understands what we're up against and what's coming. And I think we have to be smart about how we're going to accommodate the growth of the city. And if we do it right, I don't think it'll necessarily be bad, but we have to do it right and we need to do it smart. So I am done. I will turn the floor over to Commissioner Zick because I know he had questions.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And thank you for your questions because I think they did set a good foundation for the discussion. And just to maybe clear the deck on the Measure Y issue, is it safe to say that we have not had a single project in the city come under Measure Y applicability? Is that true, Mr. Preziosi?
Correct.
Okay. Is it also true that the—
Well, actually, Commissioner Zick, if I can rephrase that, sure. There have been none approved, but
yeah. Oh no, that's a good clarification. Thank you.
The development services can clarify have been applied for that may potentially impact Measure Y.
Correct. Okay, and it's also fair to say that the development of the housing element would not be designed around or given any consideration to Measure Y. Measure Y simply would be or not be an impediment down the road. Is that correct? In other words, we're not designing around Measure Y as we're putting the housing element together, correct?
Commissioner Zick, if you're asking a question, is staff designing the housing element to avoid Measure Y? I don't believe that's the case, but staff can clarify that.
Okay.
And Measure Y exists, and something's either subject to Measure Y or it's not. I mean, it's either legislative change or it's not.
Yeah.
And the housing element may or may not be subject to Measure Y.
I think my question was maybe more rhetorical. Okay, so this housing element needs to be finalized by October 15th. And Chair asked an important question, which is one of my first questions, and it relates to the timing of fixing, not in a remedy sense, but nailing down, committing to housing element before we have figured out how in the world we would support that from an infrastructure, circulation, land use, public safety standpoint. Correct? Is that correct? We have to commit to the housing element before we figure out how we actually would be able to support that in the city. Is that correct?
I would say, Commissioners, like that there's a basic level of programmatic analysis of circulation, public service, infrastructure that goes along with the housing element at a programmatic level, but in terms of site-specific analysis, location-specific analysis, that would come later.
Okay. In the staff report, you mentioned that all of the Orange County city appeals were denied. And I think you have mentioned to us before that Costa Mesa, of course, was one of the cities that did appeal. Was our appeal, a report and analysis, was that made public?
Yes, it was. Minu, can you run through a bit what we've posted on the website?
If it's on the website, I can go read it. I just didn't know if it was made public.
Commissioner Zick, they are public. Actually, when SCAG holds the public hearings, all the appeals that have been submitted, they're on SCAG website and they're available with the staff report at each hearing.
Okay, thank you for that. And then related to that, in terms of our appeal being denied, did SCAG provide a basis and rationale for their denial?
I would say that SCAG's criteria for when to grant an appeal were very, very specific and were related to essentially mathematical errors in the methodology, as opposed to arguments that were made by many cities, including Costa Mesa, about the appropriateness of the methodology and the assumptions that were made.
So is another way to, if I'm understanding you correct, is another way to say that is they didn't consider the validity of our arguments. They simply denied the appeal.
Yeah, I would say that they focused much more on, did not focus, how about that? Did not focus on any questions related to the methodology. They considered that to be settled and focused exclusively on correcting any errors.
Okay, so I'm going to, related to that question, I'm going to skip ahead to another question I've got. And it relates to the potential actions that could come against the city if our housing element was not certified or later decertified. And on the staff report, page 4, the list of 5 items is shown there. And I'm interested in both items 4 and 5 when I get to my question. Item 4, inferring that the state of California could potentially sue the city. I'm assuming that's what the Attorney General would do if there was a referral to him or her. And then number 5 indicates that a developer or a housing advocacy group could potentially sue the city. So my question is this. if we were to get to the point where either of those actions took place, would our defense be able to be developed based on our rationale for the appeal, for all the reasons we said in our appeal, that that number was no good, not supportable, didn't make sense? Could all of those reasons be used in a defense against a lawsuit, either from the state or from one of those developer or advocacy groups?
Well, I'll share sort of my initial thoughts, and then Mr. Preziosi, if you would like to weigh in. I think it's very important from my perspective, and probably most cities' perspective, that when you have something like arena allocation like we've received this year, that we exhaust all of our administrative remedies. So that was part of our appeal, is to ensure that we provided our reasoning and justification on the record and went through that appeal process. So that's an important step in any sort of future discussions about where we should have ended up. So Mr. Preziosi, anything more? Oh, you're on mute, sir.
Thank you, Ms. Lee. Commissioner Zick, we really can't accurately respond to whether or not what evidence will be used in litigation that has not yet been filed. As a general matter, certainly the items you mentioned may be used in the city's defense, but I can't say for certain that they would be, because obviously we haven't seen litigation at this point. We would not know what we would use until such time as we saw that litigation.
Okay. All right. Thank you for that. Just want to make sure that common sense and rationale and engineering judgment and all the things that were part of our appeal basis could potentially be used in defending something like that. Okay, so now a couple of questions about RENA. So the period that we're talking about is 2021, this year, to 2029. My question is this: when we get to the next cycle, which would start in 2030, is it conceivable that SCAG could give us another allocation that would be 1,000, 5,000, 10,000, another number that would be cumulative on top of this 11,760? In other words, this 11,760 isn't what Costa Mesa has to plan for the next 50 years. This is over the next 8 years. And by the way, another allocation is coming down the pipe. Am I correct about that?
So this allocation is for this 8 years. It's what Costa Mesa has to plan for. When the 7th cycle does start, there will be a new allocation, and it will only consider some instances of carryover from the previous cycle where units are tied to a specific program or action that the city didn't complete. If it's just simply that the city did not build that full amount of units, that's not a reason for a carryover to the next cycle. So it's not that, you know, the city develops 7,000 units and the remaining 4,000 something is carried to the next cycle. It's there's a new allocation established in the 7th cycle. And then, you know, in some instances, there are small amounts of carryover tied to specific programs if those are not completed.
So to restate my question, the expectation is that over the next 7 years, 8 years, we will build 11,760 units. And when we're done with that, in 2029, we'll be given a new allocation for the next 8 years.
I'll tweak that slightly and just say it's the expectation that the city will plan to build these units, and then, correct, you will be given an allocation in 7th cycle to plan for a certain amount of units again at that 7th cycle.
Okay, I'm going to take another run at this question.
Okay.
So we have a plan to build 11,760 units. And we get to the year 2029, and we haven't built a doggone unit. We had a great plan though. So now we're in 2030, and we're going to get a new allocation from SCAG that basically acknowledges, well, you had a, you know, you made a good effort, you had a good plan, so we'll erase all that. Now you got a new allocation, and maybe the new allocation's 5,000 units, and then we start over.
Correct. By the way that the law, I mean, there is, as we mentioned, there's, if the city does not end up building units, there are actions that can be taken to essentially incentivize or promote the development of affordable housing. But still, if nobody came forward essentially it would not be the city's requirement to build these units. It would be the requirement of the market. So a number of factors would go into the city's 7th cycle allocation. If we were to see a huge migration out of the state of California over the next 8 years, and it was determined that this was too many units, and that was an over assumption of what needed to be planned for, then the next cycle may be less than what the 6th cycle allocation is.
So
I would say that the allocation for each cycle is more related to the methodology that is used by the state to allocate additional units. Obviously, based on the methodology that was used this cycle, which was very different than methodologies used in past cycles. You can see that by our past RENA allocations. There is certainly feedback from local agencies that I'm certain is making it up to the state. And I think we're even the subject of statements by the Regional Council of the Southern California Association of Governments that the RENA methodology reform was needed, and certainly discussions with local agencies as to consistency over a long period of time. So I think that your question is a good one. I'm not sure we have a great answer, but we have an answer.
Okay, well, I'm going to take another run at it.
Okay.
And I'll come from a slightly different angle. Maybe I'll sneak up behind you with this one. Well, so on page 4, there's a statement that says, and I think this is consistent, Nick, maybe with what you're trying to tell me, and I'm trying to listen and comprehend. And the statement says, the housing element does not mandate construction of units. So what that tells me, along with what you are, I think have been telling me, is that we have to have a plan for 11,760 units, and it's conceivable. Now that I'm phrasing my question this way, it's conceivable that over the next 8 years, not a single unit would be built, even though we'd have a robust plan, and that would be okay. We would not be sued by the city or the state. We would not be penalized by the state because we had a robust plan. It just happened that nobody came and built a single unit. That's okay, right? Nothing has to be built. We just have to have a really good, honest, robust plan.
So I will say,
I might add to it, and zoning and land use designations and development standards that allow, or at least create an opportunity for the market to develop those 11,000 units.
Nick, what's your answer?
Correct. So you will have a compliant housing element. I will say state housing element law changes a lot and very frequently. So, as we understand it now, I think essentially what you are saying, I would say in largely part, I agree with what you're saying, that you would still have a compliant housing element were those conditions to occur.
Okay.
Again, the state sorry, I didn't mean to cut you off. The state would take a look at annual reporting and see that units were not getting built, and they would ask a lot of questions about why units are not getting built and what can be done to promote. And as we mentioned, SB 35 exists. The city would fall into a tier that is a little bit more friendly towards development than the current one they're in. So it depends on what your definition of a penalty is, but actions would occur.
Okay, so the reason I'm asking these kind of questions is because it's my understanding that this RENA is not optional, it's mandatory, that it's serious. We're not playing a numbers game. This is a mandate that we must have a serious and a complete plan for. So I want to make sure I'm understanding the implications of having a plan that doesn't work or doesn't come to fruition. That's why I'm asking these questions. So for example, and the chair asked a question that really hit on this same point as well. And I'm on page 3 of the staff report. When you look at the number, the breakdown of the RENA number, and the very low income and the low income numbers together make up 40% of our allocation of 11,760. And if every single project that came forward was subject to an inclusionary housing ordinance that mandated 15%, a very low and low, we'd never get there. Chair made that point. In fact, we'd have to build 31,360 units and get 15% of every one of those developments that comprised 31,360 units in order to hit the very low income and low income allocation in the RHNA. So I'm questioning how serious are we about meeting RHNA? Because if we are serious about meeting RHNA, and the breakdown says thou shalt have this many low income units and very low income units, then 11,760 is not the number you should be planning for. So my question is, what number, Nick, are you planning for? 11,760 or 31,360?
So
Let's start off with just, and Nick, maybe you can follow up on this, just
Sure.
the idea of the distinction between what we are planning for and what the state requires in terms of a minimum density to consider something, a project at a density that's capable of creating an affordable unit based on market conditions versus actually constructed units and what those units rent for and whether they or sell for in certain circumstances and whether they fall into affordable categories as an after the fact reporting mechanism. So I think those are two different things. Obviously the state's goal is for us to put a reasonable, feasible, well thought out plan in place in order to achieve the RHNA numbers that we've been assigned. But they do consider market factors and understand that we are not responsible for construction as we are not housing developers, but it is our responsibility to put a reasonable and feasible plan in place to achieve those goals. So Nick, maybe you can just add to kind of the distinction between those two things.
Well, no, Jennifer, I think you hit right on it. And I will add that the city will plan for a certain amount of housing. And part of the site strategy is to include a buffer in that number to try and accommodate essentially what's called no net loss, or what's known as no net loss, which is when a city's capacity falls below its remaining allocation. So the city, generally cities, we have not had this determination yet, but HCD recommends a 15 to 30% buffer on the lower income units to accommodate that, essentially that shortfall if sites do not develop as they are anticipated in the housing element. And also the city does get credit for any units that are developed within the city. So it does not mean that the city only gets credit for housing element sites that get redeveloped. Any development that occurs within the 8-year period, the city will get credit for.
So of the things that the state has dictated to us, like the RHNA, have they also dictated that we must have an inclusionary housing ordinance? Okay, so
No.
it's conceivable that we could build 11,760 units and not a single one of them would be low income because we didn't get 15% on all the development. Maybe we only got 10%. Maybe some of them had no low income or very low income housing. And the state would say, that's okay, you made a good try. You did get the 11,760. So that good for you on that. But maybe on the next cycle, we'll try to hit more of the low income, very low income. Is that what they'd say?
The state would look, would essentially say, what can the city, the city is building a lot of market rate units. What can the city do in terms of what actions can the city take to promote affordable development?
Okay. Now I will note that in this RHNA allocation, as I said, 40% of the allocation is very low and low. The statistics that you presented that showed what the actual demographics are in the city of Costa Mesa showed that 29% of our population fits the very low and low income category. So I'm curious how it is that the RHNA allocation says that we should build 40% in that category when only 29% of our population is in those two categories.
Yeah, so I can't speak to the full methodology that SCAG used. part of it was based on census data. Part of it was also based on future projection growth and certain access to transit and services within the community. So there was more than just a census consideration for the SCAG methodology, but as I think Jennifer and you mentioned, SCAG's methodology was very complex and very unique for this cycle, and the two don't exactly correlate, I will say, in all places.
Yeah, okay. Yeah, I would agree there's no correlation. Okay, I'm going to jump ahead to page 6 of the staff report, so I'm moving right along. There's an indication that there were some meetings, and your presentation covered this as well, meetings with home builders, developers, and housing advocacy groups. Were there notes and videos of those meetings? Because I don't recall receiving a notice in advance of either of those.
I will, maybe I'll, Jennifer, defer to you.
Yeah, so those meetings were city staff meetings with a group of stakeholders that had expressed interest in sharing their thoughts on the housing element with staff. Those weren't like a public hearing, for example, so they weren't noticed or posted in the same way. It was a meeting, but we do have notes that we intend to include with the housing element community outreach summary. And that is actually part of something that we would include regardless. It's part of the state's expectations as to community outreach in general, is that we have a very broad net for outreach.
So the input that the developers and the housing advocacy groups gave you is something that you may or may not try to include in the housing element, and it was just an open discussion, huh?
Yeah, it's certainly something that we consider as we do all input that we've received from all of our community outreach efforts. We do intend to include the notes as an attachment with the housing element, so it's clear sort of the types of things that were shared. Ultimately, it's to staff's discretion and ultimately the Planning Commission and the Council as to what the policy program in the housing element ends up looking like.
Okay. All right, on page 7, I'm curious about something here, and this may be another disconnect between the reality on the ground in Costa Mesa and what the RENA allocation is suggesting. And what I'm looking at is the Costa Mesa population growth projection from 2020 to 2040. That projection is 2.2%. And if you apply that 2.2% to the 2020 projected population of 113,000, you get a figure that says that by 2040, we will grow by 2,506 people. That is nowhere near the, and that's to 2040, not the 8-year RENA period. By 2040, the growth projection is 2,500 people, yet the RENA allocation is 11,760 units. And you mentioned the average household in Costa Mesa is 2.6 people. So that 11,760 units equates to over 30,000 people. Over 8 years, we have to plan for a population growth of 30,000 people, yet this is projecting we're only going to grow by 2,500 over the next 20 years. Can you help me understand the huge disconnect between those two numbers?
I can certainly try. So you're right. There is a huge disconnect between those two numbers, and Costa Mesa is far from alone in that. There's a number of jurisdictions that actually made that same argument as part of their appeal to SCAG and said essentially, look at the amount of growth that is planned for not only in the census, but in the if you look at SCAG's SoCal Connect regional transportation plan, the amount of growth that was anticipated for jurisdictions in that plan as well was less than the housing element. So as I mentioned, I unfortunately I don't have a great answer for you other than to say then you're right. There is a disconnect between those two numbers and essentially the RENA allocation and the growth statistics that we're seeing from several sources.
So here's a difficulty that I have, and I'm kind of having it through this whole thing, is I want to take this RENA allocation and this housing element update seriously, because nobody's joking, nobody's kidding around here. But it's very difficult to take it seriously when you look at some of these numbers that do not even come close to sounding reasonable. We're having to plan for something that just seems like it is not even close to being realistic. Okay, that's a comment, not a question. I'll move on to my next question. On page 8, the table in the middle has a racial and ethnic composition breakdown of Orange County, and I'm looking at Costa Mesa. There's one thing that really stands out to me, and it is that the average Asian population in Orange County is 20%, 20.1%. And Costa Mesa is significantly lower than that. And what I'm wondering is, not so much is that a problem, but when we talk about social equity and institutional racism and our housing element and how we're trying to direct the planning towards achieving certain goals and objectives, should it be one of our goals and objectives to design a plan that increases the percentage of the Asian population in the city to be more in line with what it is in Orange County?
I think that would be something that would be up to the planning commission and the city council in terms of what, you know, what the policies, as Jennifer mentioned, what the policies would be.
The state wouldn't care?
It is not part of the fair housing. Essentially what we discuss is and analyze as part of fair housing to say, should we, you know, create policies that are specified towards one specific racial or ethnic group.
Okay, so the state wouldn't care about that.
I don't think, yeah, that's not something that the state would comment on in terms of if you didn't have a policy relating to that.
Okay. All right. The economic characteristics at the bottom of the page, something struck me as being interesting there, and that is that the average change in Orange County from 2012 to 2020 was 13% in terms of income growth, economic growth, and the estimated change over the next 20 years is 9.8%. When I compare that to a city like Irvine, of course, they're blowing those numbers out of the water. They're doing great economically. When I look at Costa Mesa, we're not looking so good. Do we care about that? Are we interested, as we're putting these plans together, to come up with plans that would try to improve our economic characteristics in the community, or not? Is that not part of what we're interested in trying to do? Or are we just trying to cater to whatever the economic characteristic is? So if we become poorer and less rich as a community, then our plans ought to be targeting that.
I would say that's not one of that's not part of what we plan for as part of the housing element.
Okay.
Yeah, I would say, Commissioner Zick, that when we discuss how to plan for housing, we're also, as part of this more detailed analysis, looking at overall, how do those goals balance with other goals that are in the general plan? Some of those are economic, some of them are infrastructure related, some of them are community services related. So I think that sort of balancing of the different goals and policies is what comes down to a planning commission and city council policy decision. But that truing up does happen as part of those follow-up analyses that we discussed.
All right, that's fair. And on page 9, the table at the bottom, and you covered this in your presentation. I found this to be interesting, as you did too, based on your comment. And that was that the percentage of households in Costa Mesa, percentage of married family households was 42.8%. And non-family households was also a fairly high number at 40%. So here's what I'm wondering. As we are coming up with 11,780 units, I would imagine that we would expect a fair number of family households would be occupying those units. If we kept with these same percentages, I don't know if we're targeting to be able to house families or singles or whatnot. But what I can't help but wonder is, at the same time we would be increasing the population by potentially 30,000 people in the city, we would certainly need to be planning schools, parks, and that all those other aspects of the land use element. Hopefully those wouldn't be things, we're already park poor in the city. Hopefully that wouldn't be one of those things just discarded to the side in our planning because we put the housing element before the other things that are also important to our community. Am I correct that we wouldn't just discard that because RENA is the only thing we care about since it happens to be a state audited component and the other components aren't? They're less important? We're not thinking that way, right?
Correct, Commissioner Zick. I think a lot of the infrastructure discussions and analyses, including parks, as well as circulation and many other public service and safety and infrastructure considerations that we have are part of the planning process that follows the housing element.
Okay. My next question on page 10, and this is more just a bookkeeping thing. In your presentation, you mentioned this too, that the median household income in Costa Mesa is 79,207, and the little table shows that. But if I look on page 8 and I look at Costa Mesa, I don't see that same 79,000 number anywhere. I see for 2020, 89,000. So could you tell me, is that apples and oranges, those two different numbers?
Yeah, it may need to be, let me take a look. They're slightly different years. So because of the data that was pulled for that, it's 2018, but we will do a consistency check as we go through to make sure that all the numbers line up. So that the years are slightly different in that, but it's a good point for us to go through and take a look and make sure that we have those numbers all trued up.
Okay.
Some of it depends on how the reporting and how the projections are done.
Okay, I appreciate that. My next question is on the following page 11. And you were talking about the overcrowding and the fact that Costa Mesa was at 9%. And here's kind of my question. I can kind of understand or see how there might be overcrowding in the, and I'm kind of referencing back the table in the bottom of page 9. In the married couple family households, of which we have 42% in Costa Mesa, I can kind of picture the potential that some of those would be overcrowded because it might be, a family of 5 in a 2-bedroom house kind of a thing. So I kind of can understand how we could have overcrowding in that circumstance. What I can't quite picture, and this is my question, how would we have overcrowding in the non-family household occupancy? What help me understand what that might look like.
Yeah, so what probably the most common instance of that is, and the most common instance of non-family housing are roommates, essentially. So if you took a look at roommates who went to, say, students who went to UC Irvine who all decided to get a 3-bedroom house together, and there's 5 of them, so 2 of them share a bedroom. That would probably be the most common instance of that.
Got it. Okay, thank you for that. Jumping to page 12, in the middle of the page, in the context of the site inventory analysis, there is a suggestion that we might plan for housing development in underutilized areas such as surface parking lots. Would that be like maybe the parking lots around South Coast Plaza?
That could be one potential option. It did come up as part of the district meetings, I believe, in one of the meetings.
Was there a specific parking lot that somebody had in mind when they brought that idea up?
It was a general parking lot for South Coast Plaza, from my recollection. There wasn't a specific section of it.
Okay.
So
Down below on page 12, where the Fairview Development Center site was is identified. Well, I'll skip that for now. The next one talks about industrial sites. So again, I'm kind of assuming we do this housing element update, and then out of that, we have a whole bunch of collateral damage issues that we now have to plan for: infrastructure, land use, public safety, circulation, all of these sorts of things. If we take industrial sites and we convert those to residential, quite clearly there would be a negative economic impact to the city. Would the analysis of that negative economic impact come after we committed ourselves to the housing element, or would that be something done in conjunction with the housing element so we didn't shoot ourselves in the foot?
So there's a couple of things there, Commissioner Zick. First, any type of economic policy or economic analysis, I think is always a big part of any discussion of land use policy change. So that would certainly occur when we start to talk about some of the more site-specific analysis, where we're really getting down to, are we talking about industrial areas? How much industrial area are we talking about? So I think that's absolutely something that the Planning Commission and Council and staff certainly will follow up on as part of our next steps. We are committed as part of compliance with the RENA process and the state's housing elements process to showing how we can meet the RENA allocation at a programmatic level. So that's what we're doing now, but a lot of that comes, as we discussed, as kind of truing up the infrastructure and balancing act part of this analysis.
Okay, so it is safe to say that if what we did in the course of coming up with this plan of converting industrial commercial land to residential, if this cost the city money and we went negative in terms of our budget, we probably wouldn't become insolvent. But I'm assuming the state would not come to our financial rescue in that case. We could never say, well, we came up, you told us to do this big plan, and we came up with the big plan and it cost us a bunch of money. So you have to help us make up the difference. They would laugh at us, right?
I'm certain that the state expects that the city would do an analysis and put policies in place that would balance those considerations. And I'm certain that they wouldn't offer any financial solutions to that. Yes.
I'm assuming that too. On page 13, item number 5 talks about a potential. You know, there are a lot of ideas. There's no such thing as a bad idea when you're brainstorming. It's a rule I learned in my career. Mixed use zoning along major commercial corridors such as Harbor Boulevard, 19th and 17th. And so what we're talking about is ground floor, commercial, and then residential above that. Where would the analysis be that would be looking closely at the quality of life for those residents, the relative to noise, relative to air quality? Would that be part of the EIR for a development proposal in kind of, if somebody came up with a proposal to put residential along Harbor Boulevard on top of it? We already kind of have it, but if we had, you know, even more and more, would that be part of the EIR?
So I would say first, if there's a project level environmental analysis for CEQA compliance, it would certainly be there. But I think it even comes before then, as we're talking about appropriate mixed use policy and development standards as we go through that process. And you're correct, we already have obviously mixed use overlays in the city that anticipates housing intermixed and commercial, and in some respects, some low impact industrial areas. So that's something that's familiar to us from that perspective, and we would go through that process as part of our land planning discussion.
And as part of that, we potentially might say, you know, it's not such a good idea to put a whole bunch of housing right next to the foundry down on Placentia. That probably wouldn't be the best place to put housing. That would be something we would be thinking through as part of the housing element.
Absolutely, that's part of good land planning.
Good. I'm counting on us doing that. Number 6 talks about rezoning of commercial centers with high vacancy. Was this a specific suggestion? If so, what was the commercial center that somebody had in mind? Or is this just sort of a generic thing like, hey, if we have a big commercial center with high vacancy, what a great place to convert it to housing?
Yeah, it was not from my recollection, it was not a specific center. It was, I think the discussion was a little around the impacts of COVID and what that may do to future retail. And if that were to create situations that would be good candidate sites for future housing, but it wasn't specific to any one center.
Thank you, Nick. So my next question is up on handwritten page 5. And it's this, I guess I'll call it a pie chart. And you had presented this as well in terms of multifamily housing types. So I think I would recognize an apartment. I think I know what those are. I'm not sure I would recognize what a multi-generational housing project is, or a co-living housing project, or a mixed use. I probably would recognize that because I'd see commercial on a ground floor maybe. So can you help me understand what in the world multi-generational and co-living housing is? Because I'm thinking, well, wouldn't that just be an apartment or that multi-generational people are occupying, or a house that multi-generational people are occupying? Is it a specific housing type, or the way the housing type is used?
You're correct. It's the way the housing type is used. Multi-generational housing may look like a single family with an attached, also called an attached unit or section for an in-law or somebody else to use, or maybe an apartment type building that has multi-generational uses throughout that essentially would promote that type of development. And co-living may look very similar to a multi-generational, to a apartment type housing as well, with the one difference that generally in co-living there are some shared amenities, and essentially it's often thought of as a strategy to have a slightly less expensive unit because the rooms are a little smaller and you essentially only have the room, and some of the kitchen, bathroom type facilities may be shared. There's a lot of different types of co-living. So from the outside, it may look very similar. It just may operate a little bit differently internally.
Interesting. Okay. On handwritten page 5, the top chart, kind of a Pareto diagram showing the priorities that people identified for where they thought housing ought to go. And the 3 lowest priorities are ADUs, along major streets, and existing neighborhoods. So it would be pretty clear to me if I were to try to understand from that chart what the community is saying. The community is saying they don't want housing there. They'd rather see it where there are shopping centers or city-owned property. Am I interpreting that correct? That's what the community is stating as a preference.
I think it was actually the 3 highest were existing neighborhoods along major streets and accessory dwelling units. And I believe that the chart, I think it showed the older shopping centers and city-owned properties were lower at 13 and 19%.
The top is the highest priority. Wouldn't that be the number that's the highest on this scale, which is?
Oh, okay, I know what graphic you're looking at. Slightly different from the presentation graphic that was shown.
Yeah, handwritten page 5 is the staff report.
Correct. Yeah, sorry. The way that actually reads is when people who took the community survey were asked to prioritize, they put number 1 as their top priority. So essentially, the lower the number, the higher ranked it was.
Okay.
Yeah, I apologize. It was a little misleading. That's why we changed it for the presentation.
Got it. So I totally reversed then. The top priority destination for housing would be existing neighborhoods then.
I believe it would be along major streets and then existing neighborhoods, yes.
Well, according to this, existing neighborhoods was the lowest number, which might represent the highest priority. Okay.
Okay.
Maybe you can look at that and.
Yeah, we can certainly clarify that.
Okay, on the next page, which is handwritten page 6, I found this to be rather interesting. And again, we're talking about the input from the survey. Now, admittedly, although, you know, I don't know how much survey participation represents a statistically significant population. Maybe 465 is good. You know, if you do these all the time and just from that experience, you go, wow, 465, we don't get numbers that big. But relative to a population of 110,000 in the city, that's 0.4%. So it isn't necessarily a strong community voice. So you probably have to kind of interpret some of these results with a rather large grain of salt. But on the handwritten page 6, what struck me as interesting is that in our city, we have 40% property owners, 60% renters, which is upside down from what the Orange County average is. Some people don't think that's an issue. I think it's an issue. A lot of people do. That's why it's in our general plan as a goal to try to increase the ownership to rental ratio. What strikes me as interesting about this table is that when we look at who participated in this survey, 68% of the respondents indicate that they own their home. 68%. 26% rent. Kind of tells me that the owners from the survey are stakeholders. And if somebody wonders what's the difference between an owner and a renter, that might be one of the differences. When I look at the handwritten page 7, in terms of the age of the people that participated in the survey, it looks like pretty close, that the age of the people that participated in the survey is fairly close to what the actual demographics are of the city. So it feels fairly representative. That's what I'm trying to look at when, you know, you get these survey results. If you're going to take this stuff to the bank, well, it ought to be worth something. And it tends to be worth something if it's representative of what the community wants, not just what 2 or 3 people said in a Zoom meeting. So that's why I'm looking at this. The 25 to 44 age group, we have 35% in the community, 37% participated in the survey. It's pretty close. We have a little higher percentage of survey participants in the 45 to 64-year-olds. So I would just say that, you know, if you're not looking at that, comparing it to our demographics, it's probably worth doing to make sure you don't put too much stock in the wrong community inputs, and that you do put stock in the community inputs that are more representative of the community at large. And with all of that, thank you very much, everyone, for your patience. I'm done with my questions, Mr. Chairman.
Okay, thank you. Commissioner Toller was next, and then Commissioner Stevens.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I have a few questions and then a few comments. First question, I was hoping you could, well, first of all, thanks for the presentation. That was very informative, and for the feedback, the survey that I participated in a few months ago. I thought that was very well done. The open-ended answers, a lot of opportunities for nuance in our in giving feedback, and I appreciated that. So the first question, I'm hoping you could help me understand, and hopefully I'm not alone asking these sorts of questions. How does the city ensure, when we're talking about allocation, quotas of units by income level, how does the city ensure that those units are being planned for across that range of income levels?
I think I understand. The city develops a methodology that's fairly standard across the state in terms of basing it on essentially densities that typically develop for those income categories. As was mentioned earlier, it doesn't mean that for sure it will develop for that income category. And in fact, when we look at developments like lower income housing, It, ultimately to take credit for it, it would need to be a deed restricted affordable housing at certain income levels for a certain period of time that would be worked out for the specific development. So essentially, as part of the planning process, it is done based on assumptions, largely based on densities and certain housing characteristics. Hopefully that answered your question.
Yeah. So is an inclusionary housing ordinance kind of necessary to prepare for this properly?
It's certainly an option. I don't know that I would call it necessary, but it is one of the options available to the city. Yeah.
And would the only other way to ensure that all of these units across these income levels are quote unquote planned for, would that be on a project by project level of the city negotiating with the developer and trying to get as many low income units as they can each time? I'm trying to figure out from the city standpoint, from a regulatory standpoint, how it's easy to zone for 10,000 units, but how do you zone for 10,000 or X number of low income or moderate income units?
Correct. Yeah. The sites analysis and the identification of sites is really just one part of the housing element. The city does have to look at their programs and policies for other ways to incentivize affordable housing. So as you mentioned, inclusionary housing could be one way that you get affordable housing. Certainly, state density bonus exists. It's not a requirement of projects, but there's another way to get affordable housing. And then as some other, I believe is one of the commenters mentioned, there are some cities that provide certain incentives for development at these different levels. So similar to how density bonus works, but in a slightly different configuration.
Okay, so the way that might translate into our zoning ordinance at the end of the day, how the rubber hits the road in terms of low income units and so forth, it might be incentives, right? When it translates into zoning.
Yeah, correct. I think you could say that, yeah.
Okay. And obviously a few commenters mentioned this inclusionary housing ordinance. I guess we could write this in a number of different ways. I would be curious to hear what we think the balance is that we would be trying to strike when we write this, if we go forward with something like that.
Yeah, it's really up to the Planning Commission and City Council in terms of what that, I'm guessing when you talk about balance, what the percentage would be or what that number might be. Yeah, it's really up to City Council and Planning Commission and what that may end up looking like. I will say maybe I've seen anywhere from 5% to 15 to 20% is typically what I've seen across cities that I've worked in, but it differs city by city.
Okay.
And I would say that there is a sort of technical analysis component that goes along with an inclusionary housing ordinance to ensure that whatever policy decisions that we make or percentages that we end up including in an inclusionary housing ordinance, that they make sense from a development perspective, so that you're truly you're doing something that is feasible, as opposed to putting some requirements into place that you won't see come to fruition because we didn't do the technical analysis to ensure that it was feasible. So certainly there's that type of analysis that goes along with setting percentages as well as a policy discussion.
And would such an ordinance have a similar threshold to that 30 dwelling units per acre in terms of when it kicks in for a developer? If I develop a 4-unit, kind of a smaller project, am I going to have to round up or round down and try to get one of them affordable, or does that only apply to bigger projects?
There's a number of different ways to structure an inclusionary housing ordinance. Different cities do it in different ways, but certainly I've seen examples of inclusionary housing ordinances that set a certain size threshold, for example, where there's projects with a certain number of units or less are not required to necessarily include an affordable housing unit on site, but there's an in lieu fee that feeds into a larger city program. And then obviously at a certain threshold, affordable housing units are expected to be provided on site. So all of those details as to what makes sense for that structure is part of that technical analysis in combination with the policy discussion.
Thank you. This whole conversation, the staff report, the presentation, it seems to be, and I mean the state requirements themselves, it seems to be geared towards big developments. We're looking at big sites all over town where big developers could come in and put in a big project. That's what it just seems to me, right? We're talking many units on a project. I don't know if I'm getting that wrong, but I guess my question is to what extent can small developments and small developers, existing property owners in the city, to what extent can they help satisfy these numbers that we got to meet? How much of this is dependent on big projects? Yeah. And I mean, what is big? I know that's kind of a vague question, right? But I think you know what I mean. I think a lot of us are picturing podiums, 5/1 kind of things, or big tracts of land. We're talking about Fairview Developmental Center and big sites like that. So yeah, to what extent can smaller projects, 6 units at a time on a 100-foot wide lot, are those even worth talking about, or is this whole thing driven by those figuring out where these spaceships are going to land all over town?
Yeah, so a couple of things on that, and then Nick, feel free to chime in. So from my perspective, and one of the things that I tried to communicate very clearly at our district meetings and any community discussions that we have is that any solution to coming up with 11,760 units is going to be a combination of things. And it's even more important to focus on the fact that it's a combination of solutions because of the different housing and neighborhood environments that we have all over Costa Mesa. There's not going to be a one solution for everything that makes sense. So something that's very important to me as a planner and to all of city staff is to ensure that we put a plan together that is compatible with Costa Mesa, that's compatible with our neighborhoods and community, but is also being realistic about the requirements that we need to meet and putting appropriate housing types and planning for those in appropriate locations that most folks can look at and agree are reasonable and is a reasonable direction for the city. So it has to be a combination of different things, larger projects as well as smaller projects. That's why we talked about everything from ADUs that might be appropriate for a single family residential neighborhood in certain circumstances, all the way to sort of a larger multifamily development that we have examples of in Costa Mesa as well. So that's my approach to this. That's our staff's approach to this. So Nick, I don't know if you want to add anything to that.
Just to make a note that AB 1397 is, I mentioned earlier, does have some size requirements to it in terms of sites identification between 1/2 acre and 10 acres. And that is a broad span, but it does somewhat get to what you're talking about not having an over dependence on really large sites. And essentially, if you get over 10 acres, then you have to really make a justification that that site has the potential to redevelop. So there are some state requirements of that, and also fair housing gets to that in terms of an equitable distribution as well. So it does, as Jennifer mentioned, it takes housing of all types, and whether it's identified within the housing element sites analysis or not, the city does get credit for the 3, 4 unit, 5 unit projects to get the same credit as they get for a large project.
Okay, so that site inventory analysis, I looked up that draft spreadsheet that we got to fill out. That doesn't encompass all the zone changes we're making as a result of this new housing element. Those are the big ones, right? That's not meant to be a comprehensive list of parcels that we're considering tweaking the zoning on to allow more density. That's just some of the big stuff.
So that is not just rezones. That is any parcel that the city identifies within the housing element towards meeting the need. So it could be parcels that have an existing zoning that say it's a small one house on a large lot. Just to use an example, if the city had processes for subdividing land that could work and that could accommodate 3 units instead, and the city identified that in their housing element, they'd be required to put that on the HD spreadsheet. That is. Oh, sorry. Go ahead.
No,
I was
They-
gonna say that
Go ahead.
has to. I'll just real quick. That spreadsheet is required to include every parcel the city identifies.
So say the example you just gave, just a silly example, say R2 allows 2 units. Say we want to allow an extra unit on every parcel in that zone across the whole city. Would we just list every single APN number, and kind of crunch it that way?
It wouldn't be the strategy that we would recommend, essentially, because you would still have to look at all those parcels and look at the existing number of units on them to say there already wasn't 2 on there, and then you couldn't count it. I certainly think you can identify parcels within R2, but a blanket one like that wouldn't really be the strategy we'd recommend.
Okay. As we densify drastically over the next decade, open space is going to be getting more and more important, right? And a few people have written in and spoken on the question about open space in light of this. Have we, is it possible to use transfer of development rights or purchase of development rights, those sorts of tools to shape our city in such a way that we can have more open space near the most amount of people while densifying, rather than just, because I feel, this is a real technical approach that the city's making us take, and we're just scouring the land for every last square inch of space that we can fill with condos, really, right? And I just wonder if there's any kind of tools like that are even possible. Has that been considered?
So I think what I heard you say, are there tools to put housing or to focus housing efforts, larger projects in areas where they'll have more access to open space, so adjacent to open space or somewhere in walkable proximity? Is that sort of what you were getting?
Well, I guess yeah. There's a lot. Our city's mostly carpeted with development, right? And there's a lot of park poor places, right? Even though there's a lot of underutilized places. So instead of just further carpeting all this concrete and asphalt we have, are there any tools whereby we can reclaim some of those underutilized spaces for community open space, using something like transfer development rights, so that property owner doesn't lose his financial stake in that, and that density can be transferred elsewhere, even adjacent to that open space. I guess that's more of an idea. I don't think we've really thought that through, but I'll just throw that out there.
It's something, Commissioner Toller, we don't have a transfer of development rights program now within the city. However, it's something that we're familiar with. Other cities have adopted something similar over time. And I think what you're talking about is essentially if you have a piece of land in one location that's zoned for a certain number, that could accommodate a certain number of housing units, and a separate piece of land in a completely different location that's zoned for a certain number of housing units, rather than develop both at that density, to essentially allow for transfer of development rights onto one property so that the other could possibly be reused for some public benefit like open space. So certainly those programs are out there. It's always an option. That's part of our policy toolbox. We are doing the sites analysis now, and so we have not got to the point where we're identifying specific policy programs, but certainly that'll be the subject of a future discussion with this commission and council.
I'd like to bring that up at future meetings. I think that's a way to get more open space. And like I said, it's going to be more and more important as we densify.
Thank you.
In the site inventory analysis of the staff report on page 12, we have a list of eight bullet points. It says, in discussion with subject matter expert groups and district specific discussions during the community outreach meetings, the following areas were identified as potential areas for housing growth. My question is, to what extent are these, are the consultants and staff going to run with these in developing the next phase of this process? Are these worth commenting on now, or are these just thrown in there as this is kind of what we heard, or are they going to be informing our next steps?
Yeah, I think as I mentioned, the city is required to look at, you know, essentially every parcel in the city for its viability to redevelop. These comments and what we hear from every community outreach effort, be it the survey, be it the district meetings, or the subject matter expert meetings, helps us to funnel down essentially where we might prioritize. But it's not the end all be all. There is a lot of analysis that needs to go into each of the sites.
Okay, I have some comments on these though.
Okay.
Just for hopefully they can inform as you guys take these and study them. So first one is and I this is not to blame anyone. I think this is just, like I said, the state gave us a real technical process. On one hand, we're talking about city making, right? These are the neighborhoods we live in and work and play and raise our kids and stuff. And the approach is so dry and vague and weird. And I get it. It's just the process that we have. But I hope as much as we can have this conversation not in a silo about housing and nothing else. There are certain topics that I think that we need to have this conversation about from the very, very beginning, because we all know, I mean, this is over in 6 months. It's going to be too late before we know it, right? I don't think we can have a proper discussion about housing unless we're talking about mobility, for example. How are all these, there's been some numbers thrown around tonight. We're talking tens of thousands of new units. That means twice that many new residents. Last week we approved a project parked at over three parking spaces per unit. Are we going to keep doing that? And that's if we have 12,000 new units, that's 36,000 new parking spaces, and we can only widen the streets so much. How are all these people going to get around? Are we going to have to totally rethink the way the residents of Costa Mesa get around? Are we going to bikes and golf carts? And I think this needs to be part of the conversation now rather than it hitting us from behind later. Building types. Unlike Commissioner Zick, I don't know what an apartment looks like. I live in an apartment that looks like a house. I rent, by the way. I've lived in apartments that don't look like a house. Apartments could be, we all know, 12 stories, 5 stories. They could take up a whole block. They could be 50 feet wide. A duplex could be an apartment, right? We have these numbers and these that we're dealing with here that are 20 to 30 dwelling units per acre. I know that for environmental analyses and things like that, that's the language they speak. That's the currency they deal with. But for the public's sake, I don't know what that means coming in next door. Is it a 40-foot wide 3-story thing? Is it a block wrapped by a wall with garden? You know, that needs to be part of the conversation.
Absolutely.
Right?
Yeah, absolutely. I think something I would say about that is that obviously we're engaging in a progression of a conversation here. So certainly we don't, we're not going to cover every topic in the greatest level of detail every time that we meet, but I think that we are talking about a progression of a conversation, and you know, ultimately we know what goal that we need to hit. So part of this discussion is a discussion about housing types. And I would venture to say that if we showed visuals of various housing types in the community, that many times you would not guess the right density based on the way that it's designed. And design plays a very big role in how a housing project is perceived. And it's not about density for the most part. Certainly that's, as you said, the language that we speak when we're talking with the state, but project design and neighborhood compatibility and neighborhood design is an entirely different language. So that's a point well taken, and in our coming meetings, we'll be focusing on those types of discussions and just visualizations of what that might look like. And so everyone can be on the same page about what's possible.
I absolutely agree. If I could just add real quickly, in the district meetings, we do understand, and we try our best to keep all planners speak out of our meetings. So we did have a couple of very broad examples and understand the importance of continuing to make sure that we include examples, because I have played that game. You know, even as someone who's a planner, I played that game Jennifer was talking about trying to guess the densities of certain projects, and you'd be surprised how far off I was on a lot of them. So it is a very difficult thing to judge just based on taking one look at a project.
Yeah, and I appreciate that, and I did notice in the surveys several months ago that it did include that sort of discussion. And yeah, I don't mean this as a criticism.
No, not at all. We appreciate it.
I hope to be, as much as I can, at least my little time to speak, insert these topics into the conversation to do whatever good that can. Beyond building types, just urban design in general. West 17th Street on the south side, we've got a block being filled in, and I think everybody knows it's not very popular with the public. It's a big block. It's colossal missed opportunity in terms of creating small blocks and new connections, things like that. And it's all the same stuff. It's almost a mile in perimeter, Pomona, Newport Boulevard, Superior. It's just a block of the same stuff. As we move forward, this conversation about housing, more and more development's going to come in. Even on Harbor, we've had a few developments where we got single-family homes backing up against the sound wall, right against the sound wall on Harbor Boulevard, and it makes me wonder, what's the vision here? What are we doing? Are we interested in complete neighborhoods? And when I say complete, I mean good neighborhoods that we all understand, walkable, stuff nearby, many owners, a mix of building types, a mix of unit types where different income levels can find a place to stay, different sizes of families with their daily needs and proximity. Or are we just going to carpet everything with whatever the developer wants, because we got these big sites, and if we just take this passively, if we just zone it and let the developers, just carpet huge swaths of town, we're not going to like what we get. So I hope those kinds of questions can be part of this too. And my point here is just, we need to get ahead of this. And I know we've been pushed by the state, and we got 6 months to do this, but to the extent possible, we need to figure out what our vision is and get ahead of the game, because I appreciate what Chair DeArkel's comments were. This is coming, and all we can do is make sure it comes in well. And we got to work really hard over the next 6 months to make sure, because once these buildings go up, they're up. They're up for our lifetimes and our children's lifetimes. We got to make sure they come in well. I have a few more real specific comments. So speaking of these 8 points of feedback that we got that might inform our next steps. Underutilized parking lots, vacant sites. I think great. We're talking like Home Depot size parking lots. There's room for there's room for entire neighborhoods in those size parking lots. Other parking lots I worry about a little bit. We have a lot of park poor neighborhoods in the city. I would encourage everybody to look in our what they call open space and recreation element. Figure 2 has a map of our park poor neighborhoods. I'm in one of those. I'm over a half mile away from any park. But I got 2 churches real close to me, and they have big parking lots. If those parking lots got filled with condos, I would be upset. I would think, that was my chance for a park, and now it's gone, So I just hope we're careful with that. Industrial land, I think somebody else commented on. We need to be careful with that. As soon as you allow residential and industrial sites, that value is going to go up. The people occupying those as industrial uses are going to be squeezed out by those new leases, and they don't come back. Once it's housing, and it's never coming back. I have, a lot of family members. Those are local jobs, people that live close by that have small businesses, and it's part of what makes Costa Mesa cool and eclectic. Those sorts of things. I think we need to be careful about that. We don't want to be We want to be a complete, interesting, eclectic city. We don't want to just be a bedroom community, right? So we don't want to shoot ourselves in the foot. Slightly one tick up in my level of concern are school and church properties. I'm going to say many small schools and small churches are good. That's good for a city to have them within walking distance of the most amount of people. We do not want those concentrated. We don't want elementary school kids having to drive 2 miles, 3 miles across town and having lines of cars spilling out onto the street. Especially in light of the fact that we're growing and we're adding a lot of new residents. We need those schools. Schools and churches, they're community centers, they're third places, they're versatile, and they're assets. They're assets for our neighborhoods. Once you turn them into condos, they don't come back. It's not feasible for anybody to build a little neighborhood church on the corner anymore. We should be seeking to protect those, even support them, not encouraging their obliteration. So I'm going to keep my eye on that. Number 8 was number 8 is in there. So staff report page 13, if you're not following me. It says focus on reuse of commercial and industrial sites instead of redevelopment of existing housing sites. Yeah, that sums up a conventional approach. Freeze the single family neighborhoods so they don't change at all, and put all the renters somewhere else, right? I mean, I'm not accusing anybody. That's the sentiment that we got from some community members, and we're going to hear more of that. That's out there. Or just mow down our assets, like the potential open spaces, the schools and churches, put the new residents there, but just don't touch our single family neighborhoods. I'm going to express concern with that sentiment and ask that we take it with a grain of salt. I totally get it. But I think that we conflate R1 zoning with nice residential neighborhoods. They're not the same thing. R1 zoning says your lot has to be so big, you could put one house on it. That's it. Nice residential neighborhoods can support a surprising amount of density and still be nice residential neighborhoods. Tree-lined porches, front doors, it's not the same thing. And that's kind of the background behind my questions earlier about smaller developers and incremental development. I hope that we can think hard about how we can wisely allow our existing neighborhoods to click up in intensity, maybe in certain neighborhoods, at least evolve naturally, because the market wants them to evolve a lot of times, and we impose zoning and artificially block that. We need to think about that. Charles Marone, he's the founder of the Strong Towns movement. A lot of you guys are probably familiar with that. He said no neighborhood should be exempt from change, but he also says no neighborhood should experience radical change. And I'm just going to throw that out there and leave it at that. On a positive note, I'm going to finish. There's number 5 on staff report page 13. Now we're getting specific. Walk-ups on East 17th Street. I think we'll take a walk down East 17th Street, and this is what you're going to think. You're gonna realize that it's not living up to its potential. East 17th Street is a main street. It needs more people walking around. It needs shops pulled up closer to the street. You shouldn't have to risk your life walking down the sidewalk because there's SUVs darting out of the Starbucks drive-through, right? It's less than what it should be. Those are the places, and I think we could spend a lot of sessions like this thinking about where in our city need to grow into, urbanize well. I don't want to say all the specific places are on my mind, but we could think of a dozen or so good places that could use. I mean, where's grandma gonna live? Her house is too big for her. I want her to stay in town. A little apartment on 17th Street where she can walk downstairs and meet at the cafe with her friends on the weekends. It's just part of a conversation of having a lot of different unit types for different stages of people's lives, whether they have big families or whether they're older empty nesters or whether they're just out of college, those sorts of things. We need those, and we don't really have those in walkable urban environments. Let's protect our existing residential neighborhoods and their character, but we also need to plan for what people want. And what a lot of people want are walkable mixed-use urbanism, and we need to provide those options for people in places like East 17th Street and a lot of other places. But anyway, those are my comments. Thank you for taking notes and listening. That's all for now. Thank you.
Thank you, Commissioner Toller. And that's exactly why I'm excited about the future of the city, that we have young, smart guys like you and Vice Chair Colbert and Commissioner Tourget who have ideas of what the city should look like, and you can raise your kids in. So I really appreciate your comments. And I took many good notes, and I like a lot of your ideas. We'll go to Commissioner Stevens, then Vice Chair Colbert, and then Commissioner Russell.
So we went from the young, smart commissioner to another point of view. Another completely different point of view. So let's just have a little sorbet here. So I have a question. I guess it'll be Tarquin. We can use, I think, first names in a study session. So as Commissioner Zick, or John, I'll say John, because we're using first names, elicited, it's been 5 years since Measure Y was voted on and passed, and we have not had any projects that have gone to the voters. We have one project that I think we all know about, One Metro West, that's gone through some of the process, but I first became aware of One Metro West at least 5 years ago, before I was elected in 2016. So that gives you an idea of the amount of time, the kind of the gestation period for a project of that size, specifically under the Measure Y environment. So let's play this out. So we do a housing element, and we say whatever we're going to say. We say, here, the state, here's how we've planned for 11,760 units. And then I think what I heard, I think I heard Ms. Lee say that we then have 3 years within which to adjust our zoning and our general plan to dovetail with our housing element. So far, am I right?
If you're asking me, correct.
Okay, 3 years. So let's say we do that, and we take, let's just take a project, let's just say a zone that used to be a commercial zone. And that zone is now rezoned, and now it's a zone that'll accept a multifamily apartment complex. Where, put it on Harbor, put it on 17th Street, wherever. Okay, and now that we've done that, a developer applies for that for a project. Okay, so now we've changed the zoning. Developer applies for a project, so they don't require any they don't require any amendment to the general plan. They don't require any amendment based on the updated general plan. Would they still have to comply with Measure Y because what they're applying for is something different than what existed when Measure Y was enacted? Or does the updating of the zoning essentially supersede Measure Y and allow a developer to avoid having to go to a vote?
Thank you, Commissioner Stevens. I believe I understand your question. So Measure Y is nuanced, as we all know, and Measure Y prohibits segregating a project so as to avoid Measure Y. The issue here, as you presented it, if we're mandated to rezone as part of our general plan update, the housing element update, independent of a development project, that is, if there's no significant increase that's triggered by the zoning code revision may, but it would not conclusively would be exempt from Measure Y. And I say that because if Measure Y, if you upzone, that in itself may, but may not, trigger one of the increases. So there's not really a clear answer under Measure Y. You can look at the better argument that anything that updates the zoning code would result in one of these triggers potentially, and that might trigger Measure Y. Or, you could take the view that there would be no trigger. However, I think the intent of the voters, at least expressed by Measure Y, the text of Measure Y, is not to segregate projects so as to avoid the results of Measure Y. Does that answer your question?
Well, sort of, but I just want to just drill down and ask you one follow-up question. So are you saying that there's a possibility that if and we're not talking about I don't think anybody is really talking about any specific project here in this discussion, but are you saying that there's a possibility that once we do our housing element and then we change the zoning of that based on the housing element within that 3-year interval, that there is some possibility that the change in the zoning itself would require a vote under Measure Y?
There is that argument.
Oh, okay. Well, I'm not going to ask you to kind of play out the argument, but that seems strange to me. But so you see the problem, the kind of the chronology conundrum we have here is, if it takes 5 years to get to the point where you're going to do a Measure Y vote, and then then you're going to wait for the 3 years to do the zoning after the housing element, and then somebody might say it triggers a vote, and then once it all kind of the dust settles, then people can be open up to potentially developing on the newly established zoning map. I mean, I'm not seeing any way in the world that we're going to come anywhere near achieving actual projects being, developed, anywhere near the numbers that are going to be expected of the state. And I'm going to ask Mr. Chen, what do you think about that? I'm going to call you Nick. Nick, what do you think about this kind of the complication of Measure Y in this program of trying to achieve and address the RHNA numbers and trying to avoid the sanctions with the state, and then having this, voter established measure that we need to contend with, and the delays that are inherent in doing that?
So I'll start just by saying that I am far from an expert on Measure Y. And I would defer to council and to Jennifer. I'll just say that the state does look at potential impediments, and I don't know to what extent Measure Y is that, or if it isn't. Again, I don't know the specifics of it, but it is something potentially that could be reviewed. But again, it really just depends on how Measure Y is worded and what it actually says about development. So again, I don't really want to dig too far into it without understanding the specifics of Measure Y.
Yeah,
Well,
no,
I mean, so Nick, I will just say this, and I'm not being at all critical because we're early in the stage, but because you have such an instrumental role in this process, I humbly suggest that you get very familiar with Measure Y, and because that is you can't have a plan or any type of practically coherent housing element or practically coherent plan without a full knowledge and being well versed in Measure Y, because that is what the developers are looking at. And the only real time that it was raised in the staff report that I could see was raised by the developers. It's included in one of your bullets of the feedback that was raised by the developers. And the fact of the matter is, with Measure Y, here's how it goes: is we're just not there are a lot of developers that view Costa Mesa as simply not open for business, as much as, and I understand why we have Measure Y. I get it. I was there in 2010 to 2016, and I understand the impetus of it. But it has, it has a real overlay. I mean, use that term not in the developmental sense, but it has a real effect on the housing element, whether we'll be able to execute it. I'm going to move on.
Commissioner, if I can just add a few things before you move on. Obviously, Measure Y as a backdrop to any development discussion moving forward is a very important component. Staff and the attorney's office are working together on an analysis of it, and certainly something that we expect to have many conversations with city decision makers in the future. Tonight, we didn't focus on it because we're largely focusing on sort of a status update and getting everyone ready in terms of a foundation for next steps. It was mentioned in our housing developer meeting. It was also mentioned by our affordable housing group, and it was mentioned by members of the public as well. So it's come up many times in many different avenues. Obviously, when we try to summarize feedback, we always run the risk of not listing every single thing, which clearly we didn't, but it's come up many times, and we understand that it's something that we need to look into very heavily in terms of our paths forward. I've heard a few folks describe our task here as sort of threading the needle so that we can move forward with a compatible neighborhood-friendly plan that also meets the state's requirements and respects what folks have voted on in the past as well. So certainly we have a very tall order before us. It's not something that we're going to be able to not discuss. We know that, and we intend to discuss it. It's just a matter of having the right time for those policy discussions. So thank you.
Yeah, which is, I think we have enough data in 5 years to know. I mean, it's been 5 years and we've had 0 votes under Measure Y. And so zero development, therefore exactly 0 developments that would trigger Measure Y have been built. So that, I think, is a that is a statistically significant point. So if you're looking at if there's an expectation that there will be developments that will be included in our plan that would trigger Measure Y, I think you need to keep in mind what has occurred over the last 5 years as it relates to that law. Now, again, now I'm going to move on. So I looked at the statistics and the survey responses, and I'm trying to understand how much, if any, weight I should put to the feedback we received here, because as Commissioner, or I'm going to call him John Zick, pointed out, there's really in many ways a disproportionate feedback that we received. We received, as he pointed out, 68% of the people who responded were homeowners, whereas our statistics are only 40% of the, it's 40, 60, 40 being homeowners. So we have a disproportionate amount of feedback we received from homeowners. If I did some similar statistics where they would show that the surveys skewed toward the older folks in our community. And you might expect that because the older folks in the community would be more apt to respond to the type of survey that we did and understand that there was a survey. So we would get a disproportionate or skewed amount of impact, input from older demographics, of which I'm a member, as we established before. I'm a homeowner too, so nothing against old homeowners. I am one. But so what do we do to, if anything, to adjust for that so that our statistics reflect the demographics in the city? At least we try to have that. And are we done here? In other words, are there other methods to reach out to groups that didn't respond to our survey, or didn't come to our district meetings? And are we done with that phase? Or are we going to try to take the statistical analysis that we've done and try to go deeper into some of the demographics that haven't been represented in these statistics? If not, how much should we care about, or should we wait the statistical survey that has been done?
And I'd like to start out with just a few things and then turn it over to Nick to talk a little bit about some of his experiences, even in other cities as well. We also have Susan Emery with us this evening, who is our interim assistant director, and she has a lot of experience in the city of Irvine, Garden Grove, many other cities throughout Orange County that she can speak to housing element, public outreach, and what that tends to look like. So I can say that looking at a lot of what other cities are doing in terms of community outreach, what we're doing is far and above what most other cities are doing for this housing element cycle, and certainly for past housing element cycles as well. I've been in community meetings for housing elements that had, 1 or 2 people in it. That's not uncommon. So I think that what we're very glad to see is the level of participation. I understand that it's a small proportion of the overall community, and certainly you can't always predict who's going to engage in a survey or who's going to show at a district meeting. But we have absolutely checked all the boxes with ensuring that people have the opportunity to do that. Now, whether they choose to or not is a different thing. There's also, I would say, when we've had these discussions in the past, we talked a little about these are the steps that we're going to go through. And we're going to make sure that we have an adaptive program so that once we complete a few steps that we're going to evaluate, who did we miss in this conversation? And we have referred to those in the past as our focus meetings or our targeted group meetings. And essentially that's the phase that we're moving on to next, concurrently with finishing up some of our more standard outreach methods. So that is our intention, and we're moving into that phase in the next month with a variety of ways to reach out to those communities that we refer to sometimes as the harder to reach communities in Costa Mesa. So Nick, if you'd like to add anything, please do.
I think you covered it well. I completely agree. Yeah, we did talk. We had a very lengthy discussion with City Council when we first talked about the community outreach for this project and how that would look. And Jennifer hit on it. We did talk about it being an adaptable and flexible strategy to outreach. And it's exactly why we asked some of the questions that we did on that last page of the survey, was to see who was responding and to make sure that, try and see who was coming out to workshops, who was coming out to the events we were holding, and then adapt to see if there were other ways. We have done a really extensive outreach process, and to some extent, you're just not going to get certain portions of the population to participate to the same levels that other portions will. But we as consultant and staff have done, I think, everything we can think of so far, and certainly engaged a lot of other folks as well in terms of reaching out to, as Jennifer mentioned, the populations that haven't participated as much in city processes in the past. So we will continue to take recommendations for ways to outreach to different folks, and if there are people that we're missing, we certainly would want to be made aware of that.
And just as by way of example, we've had some contacts from various sort of, I'll say, neighborhood community leaders that recognize that we had district meetings, but thought that it might be a better effort, for example, if we had sort of a one-off meeting focused on a certain community group. So for example, organized by local church leaders or something like that, where a local community organization was essentially the organizer of the meeting. So we're following up on those leads and scheduling those types of meetings to have those more focused conversations. So that's one example. There's many ways that we're looking at sort of targeting the populations that we didn't quite capture as much as we wanted to in some of these discussions. So by way of example.
And then Nick, you've been through this in a lot of different jurisdictions. And I think Jennifer said too, that it's like, it's actually amazing the amount of responses that we got, and it could have been worse, really. But at what point in time when you have a situation like we have, where you have one group of people, and by the way, it's not just with the housing element, there's a group, it is with almost virtually everything that happens in the city council, whatever, there's a disproportionate group of people who are vocal and participate. And sometimes they're, some of the exact same people, and that's great, except there are a lot of people that don't participate. And it's good to get the voice of the folks that do, but we want to hear from the others. But at what point in time do you just kind of say, you just jump off the high dive and you say, okay, we're going to represent those folks, or we have like Russell and Kadarius and Manny Chavez and different people who are in different demographics who can kind of stand up for those folks. I mean, is that what you have to do? I mean, because we're really planning this. This is to plan for that demographic, not my demographic. I mean, I don't know what I'm going to do. I've owned my house for 30 years. I'm downsizing. I'm moving on. I mean, I'm going to go to my great reward at some point in time. And we're planning, though, for the folks that are younger, and we're not hearing from them. So do we just have to kind of be surrogates for them and jump out and represent their voice, or what?
Yeah, I think it is difficult. And I will say it was interesting seeing some of the statistics on the survey, because the percentage that participated, I believe it was somewhere around 33%, it was mentioned earlier, that was in the 20s to 30 range, is higher than we see in a lot of jurisdictions. So I will point that out. Typically it is similar with other things such as voting. It is older populations that participate in heavier amounts. I think it's certainly as the city or the consultants team, not our role to anticipate or to try and guess or fill in the blank for what that population might want, but rather look at other ways to try and engage that population. So whether it's through Commissioner Colbert or Toller or Torje, or like you mentioned, Councilmember Chavez, we've done our best, I think, to engage those folks, and we continue to do that to the extent that again, to the extent that Commissioner Kohler and Toller and Torje and some of the other folks would want to be involved, to try and see how we can outreach to that population. But I don't think it's just them. I think yourself, Commissioner Stevens, you have a role to play in that as well, to say, there is a way that you can help us to outreach to those communities as well. And so to the extent that you would like to be involved and participate in that, we would welcome that as well. But I do think to try and guess what those populations would want would be maybe slightly dangerous, rather than hearing it directly from them.
Well, I got 4 kids, so I'm not all that out of touch. So I got a couple more questions and I'll move on. So a question I have about the kind of the, how durable is this whole process as it relates to politics? Like let's say, for the sake of discussion, that the politics changed and we didn't have Gavin Newsom anymore, and we have somebody else, and maybe we have somebody that thinks very differently about these policy issues. Will this whole process of the high RHNA numbers continue? In other words, or is this kind of going to keep trudging forward, or is it volatile based on the political situation in Sacramento or elsewhere in the state?
I would say I've never seen, to the extent that we'll say in the 7th cycle, that it continues to be the same, prioritization of housing as one of the main topics. That may certainly change depending on the politics of the state. I haven't seen in the past any time where politics changed so suddenly during the planning period that a RHNA allocation changed for an entire for the entire SCAG region and everybody dropped. I wouldn't anticipate something like that. These have been well, as of, I believe, in a couple of days, the numbers will be finalized. They're all but finalized right now. They just haven't formally been fully adopted yet. But I think certainly, like anything, it's subject to some level of politics. But to the extent that we might anticipate that these numbers would change, I don't see that happening.
But it might affect, for example, the extent to which sanctions are imposed for failing to meet these numbers.
if say, and this is all hypothetical, if say every jurisdiction really struggled because California just did not build the number of units over the next say 2 or 3 years that would keep pace, and every jurisdiction was struggling, then there may be some level of action at the state to say, or maybe we need to think about this in a different way because it's not happening the way we envisioned it. I don't know that it's that flexible, but I would certainly hope that there would potentially be something like that.
Okay, and so Russell brought up some really good points about vision. I think that that's very important, and the city council members, I think their ambition is to create a vision of the city in terms of housing and land use and so forth. When in the process between now and October 15th, do we have an opportunity to express what our vision is, us, the planning commissioners, and then later on the city council members, and really have kind of a dialogue, like brainstorming, like John Zick said, about what we would like to see, and kind of leverage and harness some of these great ideas that Russell has, and probably Jenna and Gadarius and Diane and everybody else, and really establish a vision that we can share with the community, and then get their feedback about that vision, as opposed to just kind of general bland questions, but actually put that in front of the city and have them throw tomatoes at it or have them cheer it or whatever. I mean, is that going to happen? Is there time to do it? Is there a phase for it? How is that going to work?
Yeah, so we are going into the phase where we start to look at sites analysis and the development of policies and programs for the housing element, which are, arguably the two most important parts of the housing element. There are certainly a lot of important parts, but those are the two most talked about. We will be having planning commission and study session and city council study sessions coming up to discuss exactly those. That is the time that we need to hear from yourself, your fellow commissioners, city council members on these sites, on this input on the policies and programs, because at that point we will take that feedback, we will take the community feedback that we've heard throughout this whole process so far and put it into a draft document. And it's just that, it's a draft that goes out to public review to be, as you said, have tomatoes thrown at it or have you cheered or wherever it may be, to be evaluated and critiqued and commented on by the community, to then take that feedback and try to refine the document into a document that will eventually go to HCD. And the process happens quicker than you think. It's within the next couple months. So.
All right. Thank you very much for answering my questions. I don't have anything else. Thank you to all the commissioners and staff.
Thank you, Commissioner Stevens. Vice Chair Colbert, and then Commissioner Russell.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you, Nick, for a great presentation, our status update, and to staff, well done on a staff report. I have a couple of questions. A number of them have been answered. I am a part of the renting young group that has been established this evening. I also consider myself a stakeholder in this community along with the two other commissioners. But it seems that you can be a renter and a stakeholder somehow. I will digress, but I have a couple of questions related to just kind of digging into the data. But before I go there, on handwritten page 5, I think Commissioner Zick kind of alluded to this, and I just want to better understand this graph myself, as it was one of the critical questions that I had related to where we could potentially develop things. The top graph on page 5, I'm not sure if you had the opportunity to look at it, Nick.
So I don't, unfortunately, I have the staff report, but I have the online version, so I don't believe I have the handwritten one. I have what's in the presentation, which I think is a similar graphic using the same data, but I would need to confirm.
I think actually, so the graph that's on handwritten page 5, that's something that sort of comes from the survey results automatically. And obviously staff looks at that and says, is that a great visual to communicate the data? And so the graph in the presentation is probably a better one, but essentially is meant to communicate the same thing. So I don't know if it's helpful to pull that up while we're having this discussion so that it's
Yeah, I
something
certainly.
we can take a look at, but we're happy to do that. We'll,
Okay.
we'll take a look at this graphic though.
Okay, well, yeah, because my question related to the space for the city, because when I looked at city-owned properties, I was concerned about looking at development, but from your response to Commissioner Zick, it looks like existing neighborhoods are the primary target for.
Correct. It was, I believe it was along major streets and existing neighborhoods were the top two, I believe.
Okay, and thinking about that, I know this is focused on getting units, but I was thinking, are there, and I know kind of Commissioner Toller alluded to this, but Ms. Lee, are there any development standards or design guidelines that we are thinking about incorporating with thinking about unique housing types that might allow for, I'm not sure if you're familiar with like the Shaker Heights models of homes where there are multiple units high density, but they look like single family homes on the outside and multiple high density on the inside, which kind of blend into the existing characteristics of community. Are we considering things like that?
Yeah, I think part of the development standards and design guidelines discussion is something that is part of our sort of phase 2 to this in terms of level of detail discussion. But in general, we're looking at different housing types. And when we talk about development standards and ways that housing might be configured in order to remain compatible with the community, that's definitely something that we're looking at. But obviously welcome any comments or suggestions that you might have if you feel like there's a certain direction we should be looking a little harder. And certainly we appreciate your feedback along those lines.
Okay. And then the second question is related to cycles. And of course, California's new to me in a way with how it functions from my home state, as you know, which I won't mention right now. But in terms of thinking about cycles, one concern that I've had, and I've raised this before in a previous meeting, is thinking about how we roll over the number of units if they are not achieved or instituted or they're identified but don't become developed. How many cycles is it possible, or has that changed under the new methodology?
I think it's sort of a cycle by cycle specifics. So as I mentioned, just because a city doesn't develop a certain amount or a certain portion of their arena doesn't mean that it carries over to the next cycle. It has to be tied to an action that the city didn't take. So, I'll give a quick example. If a city said that they were going to rezone a certain property, which does happen, and that is going to provide 22 units of low income housing. If the city doesn't make that rezone action within the planning period, those 22 units may roll over, or some portion of those 22 units may roll over to the next cycle. But it wouldn't then roll. The city would essentially plan for those 22 units in a different way. They wouldn't necessarily say you're still beholden to have to do that. It would just say you have extra units to have to accommodate. But it would be tied to specific actions that the city doesn't take, not necessarily just unfulfilled need, essentially.
Okay, let's say we follow the community's request and targeted existing neighborhoods and streets. What if the homeowners in those communities never sell or somehow continue ownership? What happens like if we could never develop in that cycle in those areas? I think that's one of my concerns with in any of these spaces, city-owned property, older shopping centers. What if the owners of those sites never are motivated to sell, or we can't afford them, or for whatever, it just never comes to fruition? Like what happens in those cases?
So in that instance, essentially the parcel has been identified to meet a certain need. And if the parcel doesn't redevelop at all, it retains that same capacity, essentially. So the city retains that capacity. It's just that units don't get built. So there's not necessarily a punishment. One thing that is kind of unique in this cycle is that cities are required to identify in that matrix that we talked about earlier, sites that have been used in a previous planning period or 2 previous planning periods.
Correct.
Correct. Yeah. So we are required to identify those, and there actually are provisions that say and I'll get this, I think I'll get this right. If a vacant parcel was identified in the previous cycle or a non-vacant in the previous 2, and I may have switched those, so I'll have to double check, but there's by right development proposed for. at 20%, if project come in at 20%, sorry, someone came in to try and come into my office, but if a project comes in at 20% on one of those sites, the housing element law does permit by right development. So to the extent that the city identifies those, it's one of the parts of the analysis that we look at what parcels have been used in the past cycles.
Okay, because that was what I was alluding to earlier in the earlier question, because I thought that, because you can't keep identifying the same sites just to say, you know, well, we've identified the sites, because, you know, ultimately you want to build something. And then maybe for staff, I have a question, just historically speaking, or wanting to understand, how many affordable housing units in the past have we built? I know that came out during Metro West, but I don't recall the number exactly.
I can try to answer that. With the fourth cycle, which is like two cycles before this, we had some affordable housing that were met, a very limited number. I have to say, back in the late 1990s, early 2000, we had a very robust density bonus program. So we did have a number of the affordable units under the density bonus law. And then we have land use restriction for those that were maintained for 25, 30 years. So that has been the most aggressive affordable housing program that we've had so far. With the fifth cycle, we were allocated a very low number, which was one very low and one low, and I think we have not met those yet.
We have the deed restricted affordable units planned as part of the I'm blanking on the name of the project.
2277 Harbor Boulevard. Yeah, still under construction. Hasn't been built yet. Correct.
Under construction. So we anticipate meeting those affordable housing requirements, but they're in process. So the other thing I just wanted to clarify was there are deed restricted affordable units that result from, for example, a density bonus law that requires a covenant on the property that lasts for a number of years, that requires those units to remain affordable. And then there's affordable units that are affordable by virtue of the rents that the rates that they rent at, and that those rental rates fall within affordable categories. Mm-hmm. So one of them is deed restricted, one of them is not deed restricted, but we get credit for both. So you can see that there are programs like density bonus and inclusionary housing ordinance would fall into this category that would create deed restricted units. The default density zoning and those types of programs where the state is anticipating based on a certain density that the market creates affordable units that aren't deed restricted. Either way, we count both of those as part of our annual reporting mechanisms.
Okay. I'll probably follow up with questions about that. Because my assumption, and I could be wrong, but definitely possible, is that the reason why arena numbers were so high, I thought it was because of past lack of initiatives statewide, maybe with meeting the unit needs or the housing needs across the state. Is that a fair assumption, or?
Yes, the arena units, I can try to respond to that. They are a reflection of that moment in time when that methodology goes into place, where the state decides whether or not there's a housing shortage. Actually, when we had the arena appeal, one of the topics that we brought up and so many other cities was the effects of COVID-19 on the housing and how it has changed. Obviously, the timing has passed, so they wouldn't consider it in the methodology, but obviously the next cycle, you know, going back, this is the most needed housing, I guess, for this region, as far as people can remember. So it was a reflection at the time when that methodology was adopted.
Okay. And I guess in terms of thinking about stakeholders, again, I know schools were brought up, and as a school planner, I'm pretty keenly interested in this and thinking about where schools are placed and sited and how we think about that with this amount of units, and if it in fact generates students. Right now, California is experiencing an enrollment decline, so I'm not sure that schools will be impacted from a capacity standpoint. But how are school districts being incorporated into this process and thinking about the housing element, IUSD, SAUSD, others that are in Costa Mesa?
So
Go ahead.
okay, I'll just go quickly, and Jennifer, you can add on. So we have one of the ways that we outreach to the community for the district meeting was to go through school networks, so they're aware of the process. I don't know that we've set up individual meetings or those focus meetings as Jennifer was talking about with those groups yet, or if we're considering. But it is something that, as Jennifer mentioned, we look at a lot of things in terms of the housing element and potential impacts, and so that is part of the fair housing discussion of not putting a disproportionate amount of units in one place. Part of that discussion is to not overburden things like schools in certain areas. So it's part of the discussion, yes.
Yeah, and I would say our conversations with the school district on any type of future planning project, the school district has essentially factors where student generation factors where based on their research and numbers where they plan for the number of students that they expect to be enrolled in the district based on the number of housing units that we're projecting. They're very involved in the regional housing planning efforts in general that we participate in every year. Certainly they're engaged in the housing element now. To what extent that translates into changes in their infrastructure plans, certainly we believe that it does, but those are the conversations that happen at the school board level as well.
Okay, got it. Probably follow up with you on those, engaging Santa Ana since that's my employer. So I do those projections and I have not heard anything. So in terms of thinking about current growth, you know what, this is like a last question and it's just more so a clarifying question. And I want to stick to this point because Commissioner Zick always brings it up. I think it's important because he talks about renters and, the goal for the general plan to create more homeowners. And I agree, I want to become a homeowner. But maybe John will sell me his price at the price that he bought it in Costa Mesa 30 years ago. So, but I doubt he will. So, but thinking about transitioning from or creating, I guess, the missing the middle housing or just these other opportunities for pathways to more ownership. Does the housing element take into account pathways to home ownership? And I know like places, communities like Baker Block where I live, are there opportunities for conversions to take place? I know there are some track maps sometimes that are a part of different proposals that talk about conversions, maybe in the future. Are those things kind of taken into or considered?
Not so much in the housing element because the housing element looks primarily at housing units. So if a development were to convert from say rental to for sale, it would still be the same number of housing units. So from the housing element standpoint, it doesn't necessarily look at whether it's just renter or homeowner or the difference between the two. It's largely housing units that get built.
Okay, and the last question is about digging into the data. Like, will there be like a Tableau tool on the website to see like respondents? I'll be curious to know if the renters were those people who talked about more commuting and just who responded from a social media standpoint, if they were younger. Just wanted to dig into the data a bit more because 500 people or approximately 500 people is a lot. And you can get some good analysis about who engaged and how they engaged or found out about it. So I'm curious to know, like, are there going to be any tools to kind of dig into that a bit more that's available to the public?
Yeah, I think we had certainly planned on posting information to the website to the extent that we look at different tools. I think that's a discussion that we'll definitely have with staff to see how that data is displayed and how it's made available. I think the intent, as we mentioned earlier, is always to put as much information out there as we can. But maybe you're right, there's better ways to show it.
Yeah, I can propose a couple of crosstabs just in general, I think provide better analysis so we won't make poor assumptions based off of two different data pieces. But yeah, that's a different story. And I think that is it for me. Thank you. Thank you, Mr.
Thank you,
Chairman.
Vice Chair Colbert. Commissioner Russell, thank you for your patience.
Sure. Thank you. This has been a very enlightening conversation. First of all, I want to thank the staff and the consultants. I think this is the third housing element cycle that I've been through in Costa Mesa. And this is the first time I've gotten positive comments from housing advocates that the city staff was willing to have meetings, that this is a very robust outreach. I know that 400 and some people is good from the perspective of what you're used to, but I still, a 0.5% of the population still doesn't seem like a very broad spectrum. I'm glad to hear that you're continuing to look at other avenues to contact people. My question is really relating to timing. When do you think that we can expect to have the site plans available so we can look at what you have in mind? And I know that we've got there's a city council study session in March. When do you think you'll have the draft ready? When are the other points where the public can have more impact or input into the process?
So I believe we were looking at potentially the next study session being in April. Is that right, Jennifer?
Yeah, so the way we're laying things out, obviously this is our first study session with the commission. It's intended to be foundational in many respects. So our next discussion, we intend to focus on the sites analysis specifically and on the policy program with both the Planning Commission and Council. We're shooting for April. Obviously our dates are a little fluid at the moment, but April is our goal for that discussion.
Okay, at this point, I think that's most of the other questions I found, I was crossing them out because somebody else asked them. So thank you.
Okay, thanks very much. What a terrific conversation. You guys are a bunch of smart people, and I really appreciate the input all of you gave to staff and expressing your concerns, and to Mr. Chan at Kimley Horn and your colleagues. I'm following your work in Orange, and I'm following your work in Encinitas, and you guys do really good work. I'm glad you're on board in Costa Mesa, helping us lead the housing element here. And I just want to touch on a couple of points. I was Commissioner Zick's incredulity with respect to the number we've been handed by SCAG and how we would possibly ever appropriately plan for that many numbers. I feel that incredulity. I will just say that this methodology that we got this cycle was written, where the white knight talks backwards and the caterpillar smokes hookah. And it's just that way because somebody decided that the inland portions of California had been shouldered with the burden of providing affordable housing for far too many cycles. And a couple of people who have really big names and have a lot of influence decided it was time to shove affordable housing requirements out towards the coast. And that's why we have such large numbers. It's kind of spreading the wealth, as it were. Any rate, it is, Commissioner Zick, I couldn't agree with you more. We are creating a plan that would require some miracle to be able to adequately pull off, I think. But having said that, we have to do our part, because what I've always been fearful of and what I've told the community is, if we do nothing, or if we do kind of this, pro forma kind of pass at it and don't really, we will pay the price. Sacramento won't pay the price. Any other jurisdiction that does cross their T's and dot their I, will pay the price. Fines, lose a local land use authority, all sorts of interesting things that I've watched other jurisdictions have to go through because they had a population that just said no more housing. And we're just not in a position to say that right now, unless the politics in Sacramento change or whatever it is. So let's just move through it. We've got really smart staff. Let's move through it. We'll develop the standards and the zoning to kind of make sure that the market has a pathway to at least make a dent in the number. I agree with Commissioner Toller. I think smaller projects have to have a pathway to be able to provide affordable units. What I'm seeing in some cities, although reluctantly, is 2.5, 3 acre projects. And those are not real small, but 40, 50 units, 15%, you're looking at 7 or 8 affordable units. Where do you put them? Well, there's cities now are giving credit if they put deed restricted junior accessory dwelling units in those places. So there's all sorts of different types of ways that smaller projects can get the affordable housing element in it, including in lieu fees, as Ms. Lee alluded to. Vice Chair Colbert, I promise you that the school districts are paying attention to this because they're talking about potentially a whole bunch of new students and a whole bunch of school impact fees. So they're doing their progressions and trying to figure out where we're going to, how they're going to expand capacity or what they're going to do with if they have surplus properties now. I doubt they're going to become housing projects. I bet every school district in California right now is going to hold on to their surplus properties if they aren't using them because they may need them someday. So I think that's about it. It was a great study session. Jennifer and Justin, Arios, and Nick, and Sue, everybody that's here, thanks so much for sticking around and listening to our questions and our editorializing. I'm really proud of this commission. I think this is the right commission to lead this housing element process. I really do. And I think at the end of the day, October, we'll have a housing element that we can all be proud of. So unless anybody else has any comment, we'll just thank everyone for attending. I don't think there's any formal action we have to take, is there? No.
No formal action.
Just
Receive and
recommend we
file our
receive
report
and
this
file all
week.
the input. And we'll stand in adjournment until our meeting next Monday, regularly scheduled meeting on March 8th. Good night. Thanks.